This is the Art of Darkness podcast with Kevin Kautzman.
And Brad Kelly. We're a couple of very online writers interested in the dark side of what drives creative people to create against all odds.
This show is about art and the people who make it, what it costs them, and what it takes to bring something unique and impactful into the world.
Each episode, we excavate the life and work of an artist you might think you know.
Don't worry, they're all safely dead.
On every episode, we try and find out just what the hell was wrong with them and how they worked through their darkness to create something that lives on after them and continues to move culture.
Find us online at artofdarkpod.com and on Twitter at artofdarkpod. All right, we've got some sponsors for the pod now.
Wait, what?
Every link you need for the things we talk about here is at artofdarkpod.com/sponsors. First up, books.
If you're into this podcast, odds are you're probably a reader. We've got links to buy new books from bookshop.org and used books from alibris.com.
And if you want to listen to your books, we recommend and use audible.com.
It's great, and the catalog is huge.
All right. So if you're listening to this, you are online.
Maybe you're very online.
You probably have a website or are thinking of starting one. Maybe you want a website like artofdarkpod.com. We built that with WordPress, which is by far the most popular way to create websites. And the single best host for serious WordPress is WP Engine. I've personally used them for over a decade now, and I don't host my websites anywhere else. Go to artofdarkpod.com/sponsors and click on the WP Engine link to learn more.
Finally, the best way to support the show is at patreon.com/artofdarkpod. Get the bonus After Dark content for every episode, access to the book club, and more.
Thanks for supporting Art of Darkness. And I don't think that was too painful. I think we did a pretty good job there.
Yeah, that sounded good.
Yeah, we appreciate it.
And to understand Heart of Darkness, we really have to understand what was going on in the Congo around the turn of the century when Conrad was there. And so I'm going to try to keep this not too lengthy, because we could have done you could talk for hours about this scenario. And for people who aren't familiar with it at all, I think it's going to be eye-opening.
And the Belgian Congo was among the most horrific treatment by any of the colonial powers by some measure. That's my understanding of it.
Yes. It's one of the dark, to me, it's up there with like Holocaust level, just level of how dark the moment was. And so, okay. So up until the 19th century, and I want you to remember, Conrad doesn't know any of this when he's going there. Conrad has got a contract job to go to a place, an uncharted place on the map, to have, maybe one last adventure, or at least another adventure, right? Conrad doesn't know any of this context until he gets there, and even maybe didn't even really know it then.
And I get to be the captain.
Right, exactly. So I want to be careful that I'm positioning Conrad relative to this in the right spot. But anyway, up until the late 19th century, there had been very little exploration of the Congo Basin by Europeans. Many reasons for this: swamps, malaria, sleeping sickness, which will kill you even now. If I think the treatment has got to be like immediate. The sometimes not so friendly, and for good reason, indigenous population of the area. It wouldn't really be until after this guy Henry Morton Stanley. This is the guy who said Dr. Livingston, I presume, right? Famously. It wasn't until he had sort of started to track things or chart things out that things started to open up a little bit. Now, throughout the 19th century, he had various European powers colonizing different parts of Africa. And at one point or another, virtually all of sub-Saharan Africa, except for the great nation of Ethiopia, would be colonized by either the English, the French, the Dutch, or the Germans. The Congo had been a bit of a holdout, primarily because no European had been able to lay claim to it, right? It was kind of inaccessible. It's not really it's quasi landlocked except for the Congo River. And even if you look at old maps of the Congo Free State, it's very oddly shaped. There's just like this little bit that goes out to the coast, and then the rest of it's in the middle of the continent. Um, but just some statistics so you kind of understand this. 1870, 10% of Africa had been colonized by European powers. 1914, 90% of Africa was colonized, right?
Yeah. It was an almost like an arms race of colonization, because
Absolutely.
if one of the powers got too wealthy from their, colonizing efforts, it would, echo back into Europe. It was just this massive, and you can't understand any history, any European history, any world history after that if you don't understand that period. I didn't realize it was that extreme and it was that hurried.
Yeah, it was fast, very fast, right? And so Conrad is there, what I think I said, 1878, 1880. Hold on, I don't have my year for it. 1889, sorry.
Okay.
So yeah, so he's smack dab in the middle of this 1870 to 1914 period. Now, okay, if all of the colonies are, like I said, the English, the French, the Dutch, and the Germans, how does the Congo end up in the hands of the Belgians? This is where, and I'm not going to rank which colonies were the best to be under, but I do think we can probably say the Belgian control of the Congo Free State in this period was probably the worst.
It's as extreme as it could get. Yeah, I think famously so.
Right.
Now,
right.
I think it's pretty accepted and settled history.
Yeah, absolutely. So now, how did it become under the control of Belgium? So King Leopold II of Belgium, he'd been making kind of quiet forays with the help of Henry Morton Stanley into the country starting in 1878. Other countries started hearing about this and started sending people down there to kind of plant flags. And it started to get very confusing about, well, France has got a flag over there. Portugal's trying to take, like, who runs this? Now, nobody bothered to say maybe the Congolese should run it, right? That wasn't part of the conversation. It was which of us European powers should run the Congo. This led to an event in 1884 that's known as the Berlin Conference, put together by the first chancellor of Germany, Otto von Bismarck. This was, a bunch of plenipotentiaries and dignitaries and
namesake of my hometown.
Right. There you go.
Bismarck.
Right.
There you
go.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So you've got all these sort of diplomats and dignitaries, private enterprise interests at this conference, and then a group called the International Association for the Congo. That sounds nice, right? An international association. We're just getting together for the benefit of the Congo. Marlowe, nobody does this anymore.
Right. We're the World Economic Forum.
Right. We're just discussing the world economy.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Marlowe will refer to this in Heart of Darkness as, this is the same, he's talking about the same group in Heart of Darkness when he says the International Society for the Suppression of Savage Customs. That's a snarky name that Marlowe has in Heart of Darkness for this group. Now, the group, it's complicated, but it's I think factual to call this basically King Leopold's front group, and would be recognizable to us now basically as a private company. So basically you've got King Leopold II of Belgium has started up this group that has sort of like you might call it like a private public partnership. They didn't really have that back then, but it had philanthropic and missionary objectives. And also, hey, by the way, if we happen to modernize it and get a little bit of trade out of it, that's good for us too, right? It's one of these, we're going to civilize them. And it's going to be good for them and for us. But it actually was it was basically a King Leopold's private company. They managed to finagle the Congo Free State to come under this group, the International Association for the Congo, and thereby effectively the Congo became King Leopold II of Belgium's private property. Now, there are distinctions to be made between something being a colony and something being your private property, right? If something is a colony and your own government has things like rules, then they may
oh,
right.
oh, go on.
They might make rules. They might include the business of the colony as part of their parliamentary system, right?
Indeed,
Right.
indeed.
And so terrible things can happen, but you can still get a guy shouting in parliament about, this shouldn't happen, whatever, right? There's some resistance to things happening. King Leopold is just running the Congo. He doesn't have to answer to anyone, right? And this makes a big difference. King Leopold is desperately ambitious for an empire and for colony and for money. And when you take that kind of malice, just outright greed, and you combine it with total stupidity, he didn't know what he was doing, right? And so here's the thing. So, okay, you look at the Congo, very rich in resources, right? It to this day isn't particularly developed, right?
Mm-hmm.
Sure. There's all kinds of resources in that ground that could be used. And the reason why is it is a enormous effort it would be an enormous effort to develop the infrastructure to the point at which you could extract those resources in a profitable manner, right? So he ends up, it's a loser financially for a long time. And that fact leads to the brutality, right? It's like, we need to get money out of this thing that we're doing. It's hemorrhaging cash. Now, another challenge is King Leopold II could never get more than 3,000 Europeans in the Congo as administrators at any one time. So you have a country that is the size of what did I say? I was looking at the it's the size of Texas and Alaska combined, and you have 3,000 men there that you've instructed, get me profits by any means necessary.
Yeah.
And so they do. They and then who's going to go there and do it, right? Like who are these 3,000 men, right? Like, that are going to go do this. It's a wild country, far from home, few maps, fewer allies. You're dealing with various tribes, don't speak to each other, you don't speak to them. There's Arab Zanzibari slave traders who are fighting you for turf, basically. And so you end up having these sadistic administrators like this guy, Leon Fivez, though there's a bunch of other ones. They start instituting these insane practices to extract primarily rubber, but also ivory, as discussed in Heart of Darkness. They press a bunch of the indigenous people of the Congo into this group called the Force Publique. And this is they're like trustees, basically. They're like people that you have coerced by one means or another to kind of do your bidding. There's also intertribal rivalries that are existing before Belgium even gets there that they would take advantage of, right? And it gets so intense. So
hey, that neighbor on the other side of your house,
yeah,
kind of stinks.
Right.
Not a big fan of that guy.
Yeah, we should. Yeah, right. Exactly. Yeah. And dude, they're one of the sort of symbolic things of this is like, all right, if you weren't meeting quota, you would oftentimes you'd get your hand cut off, right?
Oof.
And sometimes, so this started out, what this started as, you'd give the Force Publique, these native people from the Congo, guns and ammunition, and you'd sell them, hey, you got to go get a certain amount of rubber, right? And if people aren't cooperating, you can kill them. But what you have to do is I need one hand per bullet that you used. So if you go out there and you kill a bunch of people, that's fine. If you use 16 bullets, I need you to bring me back 16 hands that you cut off. And then the hands became like currency.
Oh.
So people would cut. Yeah, they effectively became almost like a money. Like the economy is partially driven by hands. And then sometimes you would have little villages would raid the neighboring village and cut off hands because again, just think of hands as money, right? They would go and take money from the neighboring village.
I'm not going to go for the joke here. I'm just going to, that's so dark.
Isn't it? I mean, it's insane. Okay.
Insanely dark.
Okay. And then now you can imagine, okay, not only just directly killing people, but the starvation and the disease and the disarray and the chaos that this kind of thing would cause, right? I'm going to just read you, rather than trying to like totally paint the picture, I'm just going to read you a section from the Wikipedia page on this. And the section is just called Death Toll. Okay. This is just from Wikipedia. Quote, a reduction of the population, and this is in about what they call the Belgian atrocities in Wikipedia. Quote, a reduction of the population of the Congo is noted by all who have compared the country at the beginning of Leopold's control with the beginning of the Belgian state rule in 1908. So eventually we'll talk about that in a little bit, but basically the Leopold era. But estimates of the death toll vary considerably. Estimates of some contemporary observers suggest that the population decreased by half during this period. According to Edmund D. Morel, the Congo Free State counted, quote, 20 million souls. Hence, Mark Twain mentioned the number of 10 million deaths. According to Irish diplomat Roger Casement, we're going to talk about him more later, this depopulation had four main causes: indiscriminate war, starvation, reduction of births, and disease. Sleeping sickness was also a major cause of fatality at the time. Opponents of Leopold's rule stated, however, that the administration itself was to be considered responsible for the spreading of the epidemic. And there is some good cause to say that basically sleeping sickness was brought from contained regions into Congo more generally. In the absence of a census providing even an initial idea of the size of the population of the region at the inception of the Congo Free State, the first census was taken in 1924, so who knows? It is impossible to quantify population changes in the period. Despite this, Forbath more recently claimed that the loss was at least 5 million. Adam Hochschild and Jan van Sine used the number 10 million. Hochschild cites several recent independent lines of investigation by anthropologist Jan Vassina and others that examine the local sources, which generally agree with the assessment of the 1919 Belgian Government Commission. Roughly half of the population perished during the Free State period. Since the first official census by the Belgian authorities in 1924 put the population around 10 million, these various approaches suggest a rough estimate of 10 million dead, right? So basically 10 million people are killed under this regime in the matter of about 20 years, right?
Yeah.
A population cut in half.
Brutal. I did a little reading on what sleeping sickness is, because that's one of the things that we'll just blow by and go, oh yeah, sleeping sickness. I'm like, I have no idea.
Tsetse fly, I believe.
Yeah, it's called African trypanosomiasis, and it's an insect-borne parasitic infection of humans and other animals. There are two types that infect humans, but one is cause for over 98% of reported cases. Yeah, tsetse flies, more common in rural areas. Initially, the first stage of the disease is characterized by fevers, headaches, itchiness, and joint pains beginning 1 to 3 weeks after the bite. Weeks or months later, the second stage begins with confusion, poor coordination, numbness, and trouble sleeping. And you can prevent the disease, and then you can treat it. But yeah, that does not sound very
back then you couldn't treat it.
Yeah, without treatment, the disease is invariably fatal, with progressive mental deterioration leading to coma, systemic organ failure, and death. And it will cause death within months. Right. Yeah. Excuse me. An untreated infection. Oh, there are two types: months or years. The most common one will kill you after years. But yeah, that's not fun. That's no bueno.
No,
not a big fan. Yeah, it's probably called sleeping sickness because you go into a coma and
you just go to sleep eventually and never wake up. Yeah, yeah. So, okay, so how does this all come to an end, right? How does the whole Belgian Congo thing come to an end? I think it's important to keep in mind that the world didn't really know what was happening in the Congo. The larger world didn't. I mean, how would you know, right? It's you're not getting it's cliche to say, but like they didn't have the internet, they didn't. There was very few people. If you were there, you were probably part of the Congo Free State, as an administrator or a steamboat captain or something.
You're just
right?
doing one of these numbers. You got like you're waving a hand up in the air, and
right.
you're kind of like with a machete or something. Hey, the day in the life of
right.
of in the Belgium Free State of Congo or whatever.
Right.
Da da da. Here we go. I wake up in the morning and I look for rubber.
Right.
I look for more rubber, and then I eat a little bit, if I can, and then I look for more rubber, because if I don't get more rubber, I will not be able to hold up my phone.
I won't be able to hold up my phone.
Oh,
gone.
Dark,
super dark.
Can you imagine if we could just transport anybody who makes one of those ridiculous day in the life of somebody at Meta just immediately into the Belgian Congo in like 1899? Right. What a great idea for a story that is.
Just what?
The kind of like weird. Right, here I am.
Oh my
tremendous.
God. Yeah, tremendous. It's oof. And the thing is, it's well, we're gonna get even more into it. Yeah. Okay, so how does it end? A big part of how it ends is this guy, Roger Casement. Roger Casement is, he's a hero, really. So they had this philanthropic missionary group kind of running as part of it. And that was, if you were in England and you were to read something in the papers about the Congo, what you would think was, oh, well, they're running a missionary group. Isn't that missionary
nice? We're converting the natives, they would say, of course, the savage natives, to the Lord. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. And Conrad certainly didn't have all that different of a perception. He certainly didn't have any facts at hand to kind of counter it. But once word got out, and it did, Belgium had to actually, interestingly enough, Belgium had to annex the Congo as a colony. So that was the first step, was like, it didn't get independence. It got, we should have made it a colony to begin with so we could keep eyes on this place.
The audacity of that dude, of Leopold. That's ridiculous.
Unbelievable.
This is my giant backyard now.
Right. I own, that's belong. And this is the other thing too. And obviously, this, he never went there.
Oh,
you know what I mean? Why would he? Right.
Right.
Like he never even went there. It's just, okay. So, but this guy, Roger Casement, comes along. Roger Casement starts out working in the Congo in 1884. He's a surveyor and he's working to help establish like lines of communication, whatever other infrastructure. Right. He actually meets Conrad. Conrad meets him in 1890. And Conrad, basically, Roger Casement is the only white man in the Congo that Conrad met and respected. He basically thought the rest of them were all vultures and scum. In 1904, though, this is a little later. This is after Conrad's time. Casement starts. He's working as a British consul for the British government, obviously under Balfour, and some words are starting to leak out about how brutal it is down there. And the Balfour government actually tells him to investigate. So Casement basically becomes a spy. He's there on official capacity as a consul, and he's going to write a report on this. This famously becomes the Roger Casement report, which is quite a sometimes boring, but when it's not boring, will give you nightmares read. You can read it; it's out there. Now, Casement was probably an inspiration, actually, for the character that can be referred to as the Russian Motley in Heart of Darkness. I don't know if you recall this. You've got a cast of characters who are all sort of under Kurtz's spell. And the Russian Motley is the guy who just kind of lives off of nothing. He'll just like wander off into the bush. He doesn't really need anything. That was Casement. Casement was a hard man. Like he didn't need much to get by, and he would bushwhack by himself and all these things. I mean, later he would get hung for trying to recruit prisoners into the Irish uprising after the Easter Sunday uprising in 1916. He would get hung for that, and also because he was a homosexual. But that's not even part of the story. Roger Casement,
was he any kind of an artist?
No, not really. No,
okay.
Can't do him.
Well.
But an interesting guy and a heroic man nonetheless. I mean, he's the most responsible person for bringing down the Belgian Congo. the Belgian Free State. I'm going to read you just a little bit about him in the bio again. The Jeffrey Myers
So
biography.
much juicy historical information
Yeah.
presented in a fun, entertaining way by two
Yeah.
guys on a podcast. Support the pod.
Please.
Patreon.com/Art of Dark Pod. We really appreciate it. We just got another supporter while we were recording.
Oh, excellent. Thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Very good. Thank you very much.
Yeah, man. Yeah, here's from the Jeffrey Myers biography about Casement. Quote, Casement reported that Africans, this is in the famous Casement report. Casement reported that Africans bound with thongs that contracted in the rain and cut to the bone had their swollen hands beaten with rifle butts until they fell off. Chained slaves were forced to drink the white man's defecations. Hands and feet were chopped off for their rings. Men were lined up behind each other and shot with one cartridge. Wounded prisoners were eaten by maggots till they died and were then thrown to starving dogs or devoured by cannibal tribes. One girl carried the bones of her parents clinking in a ragged canvas sack and testified that starving people ate peeling whitewash torn from old buildings and then vomited up a green bile filled with leeches. Another boy described to Casement how during a raid on his village he was wounded and, quote, fell down, presumably insensible, but came to his senses while his hand was being hacked off at the wrist. I asked him how it was he could possibly lie silent and give no signs. He answered that he felt the cutting but was afraid to move, knowing that he would be killed if he showed any sign of life. So this is just hell on earth. Just, I don't even know what to say.
Terrible.
It's just
a perfect cauldron of megalomania. Just
greed.
Outright. It even goes beyond racism in a way because they almost didn't consider them to be human.
They didn't. I don't think
you can't. I mean, just terrible. Just a perfect storm of horror.
Yeah, it's one thing, I guess, to be sort of like patronizing and like we're going to civilize these heathens, right? That's kind of screwed up in its own way, but like another's like, no, you know what? Let's just destroy.
We're just going to strip mine this place.
Yeah, and that includes the people. Like it's just all part of the charnel. Like it doesn't matter. Yeah. Ugh. Okay, so now Conrad goes there, as we said. I want to talk a little bit about the book Heart of Darkness. Okay. People don't know. Quick summary. You've got this old sea salt, Charles Marlowe, also a primary character in Lord Jim, a book called Chance that we're not really going to talk about, and a short story called Youth. So Charles Marlowe, there's the Joseph Conrad cinematic universe. Charles Marlowe is the, I don't care, Iron Man. I don't know. When the story starts out, Marlowe is on the Thames with some. Kevin is very upset.
Oh no! Now we have to have a post-production meeting to talk about that. There goes my evening.
He's on. Okay, so the book starts out. Marlowe is on the Thames. Wait, Thames?
It's the Thames. The
Thames. Yeah, I was close.
Yeah.
With some other sailors, including the narrator of the book. So it's kind of this cool frame story, just like the narrator of the book, who you do not know, is writing this down, but primarily it's being told to you by this Charles Marlowe. So you've got these kind of layers of uncertainty and unreliability that kind of keep you at a nice distance from the actual meat of the story. And in the actual story of it, it's much like Conrad's experience. Marlowe goes to the Congo. He has to finagle a berth while he's in London. He goes to the Congo. Oh, by the way, most of the Europeans working in the Belgian Free State were not Belgians. It was like almost like mercenaries types that you brought in, right? Just whoever would do it, right? Probably prisoner, like probably ex-cons and things like that too, I'm sure.
Yeah, it's like the MFA program from hell.
Yeah, right.
just like an MFA program.
Yeah. Marlowe gets down there to the Congo to find that the steamship is totally in wreckage. It's in pieces. And he finds at first, and what's kind of cool about the book, it's not that he gets there and he immediately understands the depths of horror that are going on. At first, it just seems horribly mismanaged. At first, it's just an administrative nightmare, and it's not sure, there are people suffering and things, but you can't piece it all together because you're just a guy who showed up. You don't know. And it's in a country the size of Texas and Alaska combined, and you're at one little station. You don't really understand what's happening. But clearly it's like you can't get the things that you need, right? And early on, there's the one station where the guy's the brick maker, and he's been waiting for months for like some part of the recipe to show up. And that's what he does now. That's his job, is to wait for that thing to show up, right? There's another place that's been like waiting for, I think, rivets forever. And all of the white men that he runs into, or a lot of the white men that he runs into, are basically either dying or losing their minds, right? They're all sort of they're kind of losing it. And a lot of the native African people are effectively being worked to death. That's the one thing he sees. He doesn't see this brutal economy of the hands being chopped off, but he does see that clearly, like, nobody cares what happens to the Congolese, right? It does not matter. You just beat them and make them work until they die. You can just die of thirst as long as you get the ivory or whatever. Yeah. Now, in the book, Marlowe is supposed to go up and retrieve this guy named Kurtz from upriver, who's up to some, his unsound methods. If you've seen Apocalypse Now, it's effectively the same story. Kurtz is up there at the head of the river, and it's not even clear. Like, you kind of have to read between the lines to understand what Kurtz has actually done. It's almost like he's, in the way that I think of it, is he's sort of instituted like some kind of cult up there, right? He's drawn all these native Congolese sort of into the power of his charisma in order to extract as much ivory as possible out of the land. And he's super effective at that.
This episode is called Joseph Conrad's Unsound Methods.
Okay, I like that.
Unsound Method. I think it'll just be Unsound Method. Yeah. And then the Kurtz is like the Through a Shadow Darkly version of the King.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yep.
And so how are we really that much different from the state of nature, such as it is, or whatever this is out here in the dark heart of Africa? Yeah.
Right.
Wild.
Right. Now, we're going to talk a lot more about this book for Patreon subscribers in the book club meeting that's coming up. So we're not gonna spend as much time as, we're not going to spend a ton of time here, but I want to do it justice. So I'm going to read a bit from the bio about Heart of Darkness, and then a couple of my favorite passages from Heart of Darkness, and we'll kind of talk about that and how it relates to Conrad's actual life, because his time in the Congo is not that dissimilar from what's as described in Heart of Darkness. I did find this interesting, though. This is from the Jeffrey Myers biography. Quote, Heart of Darkness is the first significant work in English literature to deny the idea of progress, which had been a dominant idea in European thought for the past 400 years, and to question the very foundations of Western civilization. It shows the antagonistic interests of civilization and colonialism, portrays the disastrous clash of the white man and the African, and suggests the humane values that are needed to survive this conflict. Marlowe, who represents the European conscience that Kurtz has abandoned in the depths of the jungle, measures colonial experience in human and moral terms. Unlike Kurtz, he is skeptical about what Western materialism can do for the Africans and recognizes that colonialism is a completely destructive practice. He despises all the white men he meets and remains aloof from them, but he compassionately commits himself to the Africans he encounters on his journey to the interior. Their suffering reflects the white man's cruel visitation, just as their honorable restraint represents moral standards the Europeans fail to meet. I think that's a fair kind of take on it. I do like to think about this as, is this, I mean, I don't know. I haven't read everything, so I don't know, but I do like to think of this as like, is this the first book to deny the concept of progress? And I like to think, because Conrad Conrad had a life-changing experience down there, like on the order of like a psychedelic experience that like it's an uncharted part of the map, right? It's the blank spot. It's the white spot on the map. And I'm going to go on there on this adventure. I'm going to become this captain and I'm going to see it. And it's going to be like a journey into myself. And I don't know if I have the quote here, but he refers to it at one point as like going on a journey into yourself, into the depths of yourself. And what does he find there? Hell. Right. So imagine you have this thing, I'm going to go find myself. And then what you find is hell, right? And you can just imagine how that's going to shake loose all kinds of things in you, right? And it did for Conrad. And even still, it's not like he had lived a privileged and sheltered life either. We're not talking about somebody who graduated from Yale and had a silver spoon in their mouth, who went on a missionary trip to, name a country for a weekend. And man, we built a latrine and I'll tell you what, it's tough down there. Like, this is not what happened. You're talking about, a man Haiti. You're talking about a man who himself was sort of the detritus of history, who shows up in this place, and it's beyond comprehension. It's, Lovecraft's man-made horrors beyond my comprehension level, right?
And the novel really shows that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
absolutely. So I'm going to read a couple passages from Heart of Darkness just to kind of like, because I feel like we'd be remiss if we didn't. Again, this is from the Great Heart of Darkness.
The man-made horrors is from Tesla, not Lovecraft.
Oh, it's not from Love. Oh, you're right.
Yeah.
Why do I think that's a Lovecraft quote?
Because it sounds like because Lovecraft, created horrors, is responsible for some man-made horrors. Yeah,
right. Right. Okay, this is when Marlowe is talking about. He has this great bit because Marlowe's whole point is like he's talking to these guys on the Thames, and he's like, "This is also there." Like, this isn't different than there. This is just a different year than there.
I love that. It's such a staggering frame.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so this is the quote. So from Heart of Darkness. And this also, Marlowe said suddenly, has been one of the dark places of the earth. And he's referring to Britain, London. He was the only man of us who still followed the sea. This is the narrator talking about Marlowe now. The worst that could be said of him was that he did not represent his class. He was a seaman, but he was a wanderer too, while most seamen lead, if one may so express it, a sedentary life. Their minds are of the stay-at-home order, and their home is always with them, the ship, and so is their country, the sea. One ship is very much like another, and the sea is always the same. In the immutability of their surroundings, the foreign shores, the foreign faces, the changing immensity of life glide past, veiled not by a sense of mystery, but by a slightly disdainful ignorance. For there is nothing mysterious to a seaman unless it be the sea itself, which is the mistress of his existence and is as inscrutable as destiny. For the rest, after his hours of work, a casual stroll or a casual spree on shore suffices to unfold for him the secret of a whole continent, and generally he finds the secret not worth knowing. The yarns of seamen have a direct simplicity, the whole meaning of which lies within the shell of a cracked nut. But Marlowe was not typical, and to him the meaning of an episode was not inside like a kernel, but outside, enveloping the tale, which brought it out only as a glow brings out a haze, and the likenesses of one of those misty halos that sometimes are made visible by the spectral illuminations of the moonshine. So this is also one of the reasons I kind of picked this, is because this is where Conrad's sort of form is following function. He's got this nesting dolls of narrators, and then he's also saying that this is the way Marlowe perceives the world and the meaning of a story isn't that he's going to get to the bottom of it in the way like, well, we'll just get all of the facts together and then the whole thing will make sense. I mean, this is where we're really seeing, and we're not going to preach on this, but this is like where we're really seeing a turn toward what would become literary modernism, right? Like, this is where we start to see, we're a generation ahead of James Joyce, but like James Joyce, this is getting into James Joyce territory. It's about how you perceive things. It's not about some rock hard what is actually perceived. Let me get another bit, and I'm kind of jumping around, just give you some different spots from different places in the book. This is another passage. I love this one. This is when he's in the Congo. Marlowe's in the Congo, and he's first heading out from the station. He's finally got the boat together. And this is a bit that Chinua Achebe, the great African writer and scholar, would point out as part of his case that Heart of Darkness is a deeply racist book. Quote, going up that river was like traveling back to the earliest beginnings of the world when vegetation rioted on the earth and the big trees were kings. An empty stream, a great silence, and impenetrable forest. The air was warm, thick, heavy, sluggish. There was no joy in the brilliance of sunshine. The long stretches of the waterway ran on, deserted, into the gloom of overshadowed distances. On silvery sandbanks, hippos and alligators sunned themselves side by side. The broadening waters flowed through a mob of wooded islands. You lost your way on that river as you would in a desert, and butted all day long against shoals, trying to find the channel, till you thought yourself bewitched and cut off forever from everything you had known once, somewhere, far away, in another existence perhaps. There were moments when one's past came back to one, as it will sometimes when you have not a moment to spare to yourself, but it came in the shape of an unrestful and noisy dream, remembered with wonder amongst the overwhelming realities of this world of plants and water and silence, and this stillness of life did not in the least resemble peace. Let's see if I had any other ones I wanted to read. One more. 60.
We will cover this ad nauseum around the book club event, which is later this month. The entire calendar for the book club is at the website, artofdarkpod.com. You can't miss it. Brad is also going very hard in the Telegram and on Patreon. The Telegram's at t.me/artofdarkpod. And of course, you know where the Patreon is by now.
Indeed. Quote, the original Kurtz had been educated partly. I love that he says the original Kurtz, like there was a version of him before all of this, right? The original Kurtz had been educated partly in England, and as he was good enough to say himself, his sympathies were in the right place. His mother was half English. His father was half French. All Europe contributed to the making of Kurtz, and by I learned that, most appropriately, the International Society for the Suppression of Savage Customs had entrusted him with the making of a report for its future guidance. And he had written it, too. I've seen it. I've read it. It was eloquent, vibrating with eloquence, but too high-strung, I think. 17 pages of close writing he had found time for. But this must have been before his, let us say, nerves went wrong and caused him to preside at certain midnight dances ending with unspeakable rites, which, as far as I reluctantly gathered from what I heard at various times, were offered up to him. Do you understand? To Mr. Kurtz himself. But it was a beautiful piece of writing. The opening paragraph, however, in light of later information, strikes me now as ominous. He began with the argument that we whites, from the point of development we had arrived at, must, quote, necessarily appear to them, the savages, in nature of supernatural beings. We approach them with the might as of a deity, and so on, and so on. Quote, quoting Kurtz, by the simple exercise of our will, we can exert a power for good practically unbounded, etc., etc. From that point, Kurtz soared and took me with him. The peroration was magnificent, though difficult to remember, you know. It gave me the notion of an exotic immensity ruled by an august benevolence. It made me tingle with enthusiasm. This was the unbounded power of eloquence, of words, of burning noble words. There were no practical hints to interrupt the magic current of phrases, unless a kind of note at the foot of the last page, scrawled evidently much later, in an unsteady hand, may be regarded as the exposition of a method. It was very simple, and at the end of that moving appeal to every altruistic sentiment, it blazed at you, luminous and terrifying, like a flash of lightning in a serene sky. Exterminate all the brutes. The curious part was that he had apparently forgotten all about that valuable postscriptum, because later on, when he in a sense came to himself, he repeatedly entreated me to take care of what he called my pamphlet, as it was sure to have in the future a good influence upon his career. I had full information about all these things, and besides, as it turned out, I was to have the care of his memory. I've done enough for it to give me the indisputable right to lay it, if I choose, for an everlasting rest in the dustbin of progress. So yeah.
You can't do a narrow reading of that book and dismiss it as racist or otherwise.
No, and I don't I'd
It's
almost,
way more complicated than that.
yeah, I think that's probably the easiest way to put it. Sure. I mean, it's the first novel to speak out against colonialism. How is it?
Who are the brutes that ought to be exterminated?
Well, that's a great question, right? That is a great question. I'm not even going to answer that or try to.
Yeah, we'll just leave that. And
We'll
then,
leave
hey,
it.
join us on the book club if you're into it.
Mhm.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Now, Conrad, I want to talk briefly about Conrad's experience himself in the Congo, right? Because it's largely matches Marlowe's, but it's not the same. And in some ways, it's more intense. Okay. Um, he had signed a 3-year contract, right, to work in the Congo. Now, he didn't even last a year. Apparently, less than 10% of the people would work their entire contract. Everybody gets sick or dies, basically. Um, on the trip down, this is talked about in the in the book Heart of Darkness. He does see the famous scene of the ship, one of my favorite phrases in the book, firing into a continent. Right, he just sees this boat just firing into the land, and this is actually Conrad actually saw this the very beginning of a French campaign against the Dahomey, which the movie The Woman King that came out recently was about. So just kind of a historical thing. After some months in this town of Matadi near the coast, Conrad is on his ship going up to Kinshasa. He's supposed to go up to Kinshasa to get on his boat, but you have to go past these unnavigable cataracts in the river. So you can't take a boat up to Kinshasa, at least then. I don't know what the situation is now, but then you couldn't. So he has to cover 230 miles on foot in the jungle. Yeah, it takes him over a month to do this, right? And it's mosquitoes and heat and foul drinking water. And when you go to go to bed at night, you just hear menacing drums off in the distance. Can you imagine? And people are telling you that there are cannibal tribes, and there are cannibal tribes, right? Just unbelievable.
I
right?
can't even imagine. Yeah, this guy. Yeah.
Yeah.
Jeez,
And he's
just
also
stay home with your very stern betrothed. Did they get married? Did I miss that part?
No, he
No,
does
yeah.
marry a woman, but not that
Okay.
woman.
Okay. All right. Yeah.
Yeah. But what's crazy is while he's doing this hike, he's also writing Allmeyer's Folly, his first book, in a little notebook, which is just crazy, right? He has this feverish companion that he has to like nurse back to health. This guy's practically dying, and that guy appears in the book. There's a part where they're talking about how they have to carry a guy out on a stretcher, and he weighs like 200 and some odd pounds. This apparently happened. Conrad does encounter cannibals. He's not in conflict with them. He actually doesn't have any beef with. He's fine with the cannibals. They seem okay. And
you don't want to get on the bad side of the cannibals.
Yeah, but he does apparently. Conrad at one point asks this guy. He says, do you really eat human flesh? And the cannibal says, I wish I could eat everyone on Earth.
It's so metal. It's so.
It is.
I normally reserve that sound for Crowley, but that deserved that. Yeah. This is a very metal episode. There's a lot going on. I wish I could eat everyone on Earth.
Right.
Oh,
crazy, right?
Yeah.
Conrad apparently does not get on well with his boss. Now, remember, I said earlier, Conrad loathed all of the white men he met in Africa except for Roger Casement.
It comes across in the novel as well, and I think that if you do a reading where you're looking for like a really strongly racist read, of course it is. I mean, it's racist in the sense that it was an extraordinarily racist time. Even most people would say our time is still racist. So it's there. It's of a time. But if you read between the lines and you pick up his snark and the twinge of irony in statement after statement after statement in the novel, makes it very clear that he's indicting the entire system.
Right. Absolutely. 100%. Yeah. He's got nothing good to say about any of the Europeans, basically. Yeah, that he comes across. And Kurtz is like a villain, and the only Marlowe's kind of trapped in his charismatic orbit, but also understands that he's not a good actor either. Right. Conrad gets posted up at what was called Stanley Falls, now Boyoma Falls, 1,000 miles inland eventually. And then he has a falling out with his boss, and his boss is like, "Hey, you have no prospects here. Like, this is not going to work out for you." This is what Conrad's boss tells him. 1,000 miles dead middle of Africa, and your boss is like, "I don't think so, man."
You're 4 years into your PhD program,
right.
and your advisor pulls you aside.
Yeah.
There's been some talk.
Yeah.
Mm.
Now, Conrad would get dysentery, and dysentery is the thing that actually allowed him to go home, right? He because he got very, very sick.
You know what I think of every time when I hear dysentery? This is a great joke from Annie Hall, Woody Allen. Oh, I thought I heard commentary and dissent merged and formed dysentery.
I don't remember that. That's hilarious.
It's a funny line.
Yeah. So I've got let me read just a couple little bits. Here's Conrad in a letter talking about this is when he's in the Congo, or it might have been actually just a journal entry. Quote, "My days here are dreary. No use deluding oneself. Decidedly, I regret having come here. I even regret it bitterly. Everything here is repellent to me, men and things, but men above all, and I am repellent to them also. From the manager in Africa who has taken the trouble to tell one and all that I offend him supremely down to the lowest mechanic, they all have the gift of irritating my nerves, so I am not as agreeable to them perhaps as I should be. Right? The manager is a common ivory dealer with base instincts who considers himself a merchant, although he is only a kind of African shopkeeper. His name is Del Commune. He detests the English, and out here I am naturally regarded as such. I cannot hope for either promotion or salary increases while he is here." And it goes on like that, right? And then eventually he does get to leave. I'm just going to read this quick part about him leaving. Quote, "Conrad left Boma for Belgium during the second week in December after stopping for 1890. After stopping for a few days to see Marguerite in Brussels, he reached London on February the 1st, 1891, and began his dismal convalescence. Quote, "When he arrived," his friend Hope recalled, "he looked half dead with fever. So Krieger, who knew the doctor at the German hospital, got him in there, and he and I used to go see him frequently. The nurse said she thought he would die. But he pulled around, and in a few days was able to go to his rooms." So Conrad was extremely ill, and he would suffer from blackwater malaria. And what blackwater malaria is apparently, I hadn't heard of this before, is apparently a strain of malaria that will make, when you're suffering a fit of it or an episode of it, will make your urine black.
Once again, so metal.
Right.
Yeah, that's not good.
No,
that's bad.
That's not good. You don't want your.
Can you imagine you go to take a leak in the morning and it just comes out just jet black?
Oh God.
Like a
right.
like a 90s goth black pleather pants from Hot Topic. Just a stream of black.
Unbelievable, right? Oh my God.
Dark.
Yeah. And he would later have, well, we're going to get into it in a minute. We're like, I'm not going to give an estimate, but we're coming around the bend. Most of the biographical stuff I wanted to do was actually up to and through the Congo. So
totally makes sense. And we're back in London now. Is that the last time he ever goes on
it's
the
basically
water,
the last time he didn't know he was done, but he was basically done. I think he might
I
have
would be
one
done
more
after that. I would be done after that too.
Yeah, he has a couple trips to Australia, I believe, on steamships, so they're fairly, uneventful in a way.
Sure.
But he does start to make, one is a passenger ship, and he actually starts to make some friends who are like part of kind of high society. But he does have this, he's in rough shape after Africa. He starts to have gout pretty bad. And I don't know, there are various causes for gout, but I have to imagine that gout is about a buildup of uric acid, right? And I have to imagine most people get it from like drinking or, meat, like too much meat in there. There's a bunch of reasons you can get it. And it's fairly easily treatable now. But I have to imagine that if you have a virus in your body that occasionally makes you pee black, that might have something to do with your uric acid.
I'm not a doctor, but I play one on a podcast.
Yeah.
Potato.
Yeah. Now he said it's kind of sad. Think about this, right? This is before he's a writer. He's not a writer now. He's just come back from the Congo. He's in his 30s. He's let's see, he'd be like in his mid 30s almost. And he says, I've spent 20 years of my life mastering an art that nobody needs. Right. Just
Oh,
that's
and so
not
now he's going to go be a writer.
right. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Good job.
perfect. Yeah, right. Just try to swap one useless thing for another.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
am kidding.
Of
We
course.
we are both writers. We respect
Oh
writers. You can
man.
make a
Yeah, I know.
very tidy living as a writer. You may not get rich from a
Yeah.
novel,
Right.
but there are a lot of ways to make a very good living. And actually,
Oh,
being able to communicate effectively as a writer is a very, very important skill for
oh
anybody to have.
man. To me, writing is indistinguishable from thinking. So, yeah. So, and so imagine if you get really good at writing. That's the way I think about it. Um, so anyway, he's got this first book called Allmayer's Folly. He does get it published. He does get this thing published, I think in 1894. And it doesn't do really, really well, but a few reviewers kind of notice it, right? He's kind of puts himself on the scene. And of course, you know, you don't get to have an overnight success. Very few people do. And the people who do, if it's immediate, that's usually it. A lot of times you'll kind of see this with various artists. It's like if the success comes immediately, there's like no longevity to it. Oftentimes, I've kind of noticed this pattern. So Conrad has goes the long way to success. Um. Okay. So the first year, the year that he gives up, it's an interesting year for him. The year that he gives up the sea, he meets his wife and becomes a published writer in the same year, right? So you'll notice this. We've noticed this too in other people's career, in other people's biographies, where they have like this like hinge year where like
Mm-hmm.
suddenly a bunch of stuff happens all at once, and it's like, huh,
2023 is our hinge year, Brad.
boom,
It's
yeah,
it's
that's
happening.
right. Let's
Yeah,
do
it's
it.
good.
Yeah,
All right.
my pee doesn't have to be black for that, does it? Can I do
Well,
it?
again, we got to talk on that post-production meeting, man. After that one analogy you made, I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So from Allmayer's Folly, which we're not going to talk about in depth. Like I said, he's got a bunch of novels. We can't talk about them all in depth. It's one of his seafaring novels set in the Malaysian area. But after that, his reputation pretty much steadily rises until the point where basically his last book is his best-selling book, effectively. So it's pretty much a straightforward kind of linear progression into success from here on out, from sort of the mid 1890s on. I want to describe, and we're going to describe his like later, much of a big chunk of his later years in kind of four channels, at least at this part. And then we're going to talk some more. We're going to get kind of to a linear narrative, but I want to talk about four aspects of his life. The first is money. Then we're going to talk about his wife and family. Then we're going to talk about his health. And then we're going to talk about his writing. And this is going to be kind of scattershot. We're going to be jumping back and forth in time a little bit. Conrad, like practically every writer ever, was terrible with money. Writing paid better than it does now, of course, like a novel does or a short story does, right? But it was, it was still it was a small market. And it was a long time before Conrad really made money from it, like something you could live off of. So even if you are like, hey, I can get $2,000 off a short story, which is a lot now, you do two of those a year. What's that add up to, right? So he's constantly borrowing money and less constantly paying it back. He's always trying to negotiate bigger advances or for smaller payouts on the back end and things like that. He's always looking out for handouts in terms of editing, places to live, et cetera, et cetera. And he's doing this like practically up till the end, maybe up until like the last decade of his life. He's got to do these sorts of things. It gets to the point late in life. I mean, this is after he's a name that he's selling manuscripts. He has this collector he sells manuscripts to. This is the first draft of Heart of Darkness. This is the second handwritten version of whatever, right? And he's selling them to this guy. He meets a guy who is a forger who says, Conrad, if you and I work together and we forge a little manuscript, say it's the first draft of Lord Jim, and I show you how to forge something and you help me out, we could sell that for a lot of money. And so he actually does this in his later years. And
doing crime.
Right. Right. But he's forging his own, quote, original manuscripts, right?
Oh,
yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's unpleasant. I don't like that from him. I don't like
neither.
that. Yeah.
No, me neither. his around the time of
But
his
I also
marriage.
like that
Yeah,
he's a little tricky. I like that he's a little
yeah,
trickster and he sort of,
yeah.
yeah, I do
I mean,
appreciate that.
he's
Because the
crafty.
world, the world dealt him a raw
They
hand.
did. It
And
really did.
so, yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
right.
has to get a little of his own on his back end, you know. Around the time of his marriage, he does get an inheritance from his uncle Thaddeus, who dies. It's 16,000 rubles. I tried to figure out like how much money that is, and it was hard to. I don't know. I don't know. It was enough. It was a chunk of change, and then apparently he lost it all via the bankruptcy of some gold mining company in South Africa. It was very complicated, so he loses his entire inheritance. Um, Hard to
Boy,
tell how much fault that
he
was
may
his.
be, I think he's the top contender for the worst with money that we've seen yet.
He might be. He
I
might
think
be.
he is
Yeah.
because, yeah, this is pretty
Yeah.
bad.
Yeah. He would, and
Yeah.
this is the thing, he would always wear out his welcome. Like 'cause he would get an editor, and the editor would be like, well, here's $2,000 for this book. And Connor would be like, well, how about 5,000 for the next one? And it'd be like, well, we didn't sell any of this one. Like, you have to prove yourself to be a money making enterprise before we invest in you, right? Conrad was always pushing the envelope when it came to this kind of
Mhm.
stuff. Now he
Mhm.
would get saved by occasionally by things like the Royal Literary Fund, which was, the government would recognize that you were a talented artist contributing to the culture, and they would give you a fairly unrestricted grant. Sounds impossible now.
Yeah, imagine. Can you imagine?
Yeah. In 1902, Conrad asks for a large advance from William Blackwood. And William Blackwood is the man behind Blackwood's magazine, which first serialized Heart of Darkness. Um, Conrad was so insistent about it that it basically severed the relationship with Blackwood. Blackwood was like, who played reasonably well, was just like, I can't put up with Conrad. He's asking for money all the time. He's like constantly pestering us. And he did this. My point is, he did this with a number of other people. Right? He's always
Mhm.
wearing out his financial welcome.
Mm.
Because of this, because of how much he was wearing out his welcome, his first 11 books were brought out by 6 different publishers.
He kept burning bridges.
Yeah, yeah.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, so I'm going to give you a little bit from his agent. This is in 1899. His agent, James Pinker. This is something that he said. This is some things he said about Conrad. Um, let's see. Oh no, sorry. This is Conrad talking to Pinker, trying to explain to him the challenges of being Conrad the writer as a business enterprise. Quote, my method of writing method. My
There it
method of
is.
writing is so unbusinesslike that I don't think you could have any use for such an unsatisfactory person. This is him talking to his agent. I generally sell a work before it is begun, get paid when it is half done, and don't bother the other half till the spirit moves me. I must add that I have no control whatever over the spirit. Neither has the man who has paid the money. The above may appear fanciful to you, but it is the sober truth, right? And I think writers can relate to that. Now, here's another thing about the relationship with Pinker. Quote, this is again from the biography, the Jeffrey Myers biography. Quote, despite the prize from the Academy, grants of £300 and £200 from the Royal Literary Fund in 1903 and 1908, £500 from the Royal Bounty Fund in 1905, and a civil list fund of £100 a year in 1910, I think you can multiply these by 100 and get roughly American dollars now. So $100 a year is like $10,000 a year. Conrad shuddered to think how much he owed Pinker, his literary agent of the last decade, who frequently advanced him considerable sums of money. Conrad estimated that he lived on £650 a year, and by 1908, he owed Pinker as much as £1,600. So that's, over $100,000.
16. Oh, yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
geez. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay.
Yeah. The following
Oof.
year, his total debt amounted to £2,250, for which he paid £100 annual interest. Pinker managed Conrad's finances, paid for milk, cigars, hotel rooms, and a new coat for Jessie, Conrad's wife. He even replaced the money when Conrad's pocket was picked. When Conrad's bankers, Watson and Company, failed in 1904, Pinker helped cover the overdraft of £200. In 1907, Conrad helped to settle down on a secure financial basis within 3 years, but in 1908, his 13 books brought in less than £5 in royalties. In 1912, he complained to the wealthy Edith Wharton that after 16 years of scribbling, he was still living from day to day. Pinker was paying Jessie's medical bills as late as 1919. That's Conrad's wife is Jessie. 1919. Conrad dies in 1924, right? So the money situation was always tough. Always.
Yeah.
Even when he almost right up until the end, he got kind of rich right at the end, basically.
Okay. All right. Well, at least there's that.
Yeah. Now we'll talk briefly about his wife and his family. Jessie George was his wife. It's funny, I wrote 1894 when they met. She was 21 and Conrad was 37, which I don't know how unusual that was for the time, but it's interesting. She would be one of only 2 women with whom we know that Conrad had sex. So there's a later affair that Conrad has, and I'll talk about that when we get there. Very unlikely marriage. Jessie is an English girl, right? Conrad is Conrad. He's a Pole who barely speaks English, and he's nervous and dandy and mean. You know, he's a strange guy. Jessie was provincial, plain, utterly, completely alien to Conrad's back. I mean, Conrad might as well have been from Mars to her, right?
I think to a lot of people.
Yeah. This was kind of his strange attractive power to some people in England. It was like, who is this guy, right? Her mother, Jessie's mother, was awful, and after a few years of marriage, Conrad banned her from their house. So apparently she was like very strict and controlling and judgmental, and Conrad was just like out, never come back. Jessie herself, her probably most prominent feature, according to people who knew her, was her almost unnaturally imperturbable temperament. She basically never showed any emotion, to the point her son Boris found it frightening as a child. That she was so like flat that it was unsettling to people.
Interesting.
Now Conrad had said in a letter to her before they got married, quote, since we had, quote, not very long to live and no intention of having children, I thought we might spend a few happy years together.
Romantic.
Right, very romantic.
Yeah, right.
After about a year of courting, they met someplace. He insulted her clothes and then essentially ordered her to marry him.
This is a classic PUA tactic. You neg and then you propose. Neg, young men, neg, propose. Maybe get a little drunk first.
All of these, all of these are bad tips.
Yeah, I mean, definitely do not do that.
You should propose at some point, but
yeah. Actually, in fact, it would be helpful. I would love to live in a world where I didn't have the word neg in my vocabulary. I would like to go back. Yeah. Can we go back? We can never go back, can we?
No, we can't go. It's a more innocent time. Yeah. And then he shows up, he negs her, he basically orders her to marry him, and then he gets food poisoning and ghosts her for 3 days. Like she doesn't even know like what just happened to her, right? And then let me give you a little bit of a letter that he wrote to his cousin about Jessie and about getting married and all these things. Let's see if I can find it real quick. Yeah, here we go. This is Conrad writing to his cousin. Quote, no one can be more surprised at it than myself. However, I am not frightened at all. This is as they're getting married. They're engaged. I am not frightened at all, for, as you know, I am accustomed to an adventurous life and to facing terrible dangers. Moreover, I have to avow that my betrothed does not give the impression of being at all dangerous. Jessie is her name, George her surname. She is small, not at all striking looking, to tell the truth, alas, rather plain, who nevertheless is very dear to me. When I met her a year and a half ago, she was earning her living in the city as a, quote, typewriter in an American business office of the Calligraph Company. Her father died 3 years ago. There are 9 children in the family. The mother is a very decent woman, and I do not doubt very virtuous as well. He would come to not like her, but at this point he was okay. However, I must confess that it is all the same to me, as I am not marrying the whole family. The wedding will take place on the 24th of this month, and we shall leave London immediately so as to conceal from people's eyes our happiness or our stupidity, amidst the wilderness and beauty of the coast of Brittany, where I intend to rent a small house in some fishing village. Now, they do go on honeymoon, but Catch this. Okay. This is another quote from the biography. Quote, on his wedding night, Conrad was either indifferent about sex with Jesse or anxious about deflowering his bride. In any case, he felt the need to delay consummation and was more interested in catching up with his correspondence than in sleeping with his wife. He stayed up until 2 a.m. writing inconsequential letters and then went out to post them in the middle of the night, though they could not possibly be collected until morning. His anxiety continued the next day when they crossed the channel to St. Malo, and Conrad, as well as Jesse, became seasick. So during their honeymoon, and their honeymoon was 6 months in a peasant's cottage in Brittany, right? During this time, Conrad writes a short story called, quote, The Idiots, about a woman who produces 4 mentally defective children and then kills her husband with scissors while repelling his sexual advances. So that in his honeymoon is the story he comes up with writing.
I did not expect him to be so neurotic.
He's extremely neurotic.
That is the biggest surprise. The childhood is a huge surprise to me. Mm-hmm. And then this, you would expect a different thing from the person who wrote Heart of Darkness. You'd expect sturdier stock or kind of like a Hemingway type. And instead I'm getting kind of like a weaselly, kind of a bit of a money, like a hungering after. It's not what I expected.
No, I had the same reaction too. It's like he survived 20 years of sailing. Yeah, you expect like a man's man. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. He's out like sending letters in the middle of the night while his new wife is there waiting or not waiting. And then he gets seasick after. You have no permission to get seasick after 20 years at sea, buddy.
Right. I had the same reaction. I was like, how did he get seasick? And it made me think, wait, he probably was just making it up.
It may be.
Right.
Yeah. Or it could be like sympathy with her, or maybe it was something they ate. Yeah.
Could be. Yeah. He also apparently tended to run the house like he was the captain of a ship. Right. Oh. So very explicit instructions for Jesse down to when she should change clothes. You know, you'll change into dinner clothes at this time. He would commonly hire a significant amount of help. So even when they're like poor, there's like a gardener and a maid, you know, which, yeah. Eventually Jesse does, bear children, which again, Conrad was not really, looking for. And he was not particularly interested in the children. And apparently got upset that Jesse had somehow played him false when she got pregnant, though what that even means is not entirely clear.
I mean, he spent 20 years at sea. He doesn't know how the plumbing works.
He might not.
Ever.
Right.
No, of course he does. But well, maybe, who knows?
Who knows?
We can merely speculate.
Yeah, you don't know what conversations
how many babies have been conceived, children have been conceived when a woman pulls the goalie, or a man does something that, he ought not to, if it's understood we're not trying to have a baby. It's a very easy little error to make there.
Yeah, and we don't know exactly what the agreements or not agreement, but anyway,
babies are very, very ready to come into the world.
That's very true. That's also very true. Yeah. But anyway, larger point, Conrad apparently found the boys. There were 2 boys, particularly when they were infants, quote, totally objectionable.
Oh no.
Not good. When your dad's like, I find this situation totally objectionable. That's not good.
I find you.
Right.
I object to you.
Yeah. When you're an infant. That's not right.
Not every good. Parent finds their child.
Oh, there's moments, right? Yeah.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. What the child does is objectionable. The child is not objectionable.
Right. Yeah. So, apparently there's at one point Conrad just like, it didn't even make sense to anybody. Oh, one time he had to like hold on the train. He had to briefly hold the baby and like, they're like managing luggage and stuff. And he just found that like unacceptable. He would, when they traveled, at least for a while, he wanted Jesse and the children to pretend they weren't together.
Ooh. Yeah.
And at one point he in a fit of like frustration or something, he threw the bag of I think it was John, the second boy. He threw the bag of the boys' clothes out the train window.
Oh no.
just like out of some kind of weird fit of something.
My
Yeah.
initial reaction is to like him even less, but in
Mhm.
the context of this episode and what you explained about his childhood, I can understand that there would be, and everything that he's seen in his life and the amount of trauma he's probably carrying around. I don't hold a grudge for this. It's
Yeah.
loathsome behavior, but
Yeah.
given what he went through and the early
Yeah.
loss of his parents, I could see it being
He's not
difficult.
he's not a stable guy. Like you said, he's
No,
neurotic. He had massive depressive episodes throughout his life too, right? So he's a mentally he has mental illness, really. And not to skirt blame for loathsome behavior because of that, but like you're not dealing with a guy who's got it all
sure.
sorted out, right?
No,
Um
yeah.
in 1905, Jesse has a kind of a breakdown, out of stress, probably from living with Conrad. And something happens in this that exacerbates this knee injury that she'd had way back in 1889. And this leads to a slow downward spiral. 1905. By 1908, because of her knee thing, she was in so much immobility and pain that they couldn't seem to treat that she was basically started to drink and eat her way into an early grave. Um, and this would lead to like she gets quite large. She's causing scenes every once in a while. When they
Mm.
go on travel, she has to be like carted around and like put on chairs and lifted into things, and it's always complicated and expensive, right? To get her to go anywhere. She'd have countless surgeries that never seemed to actually improve anything. Um, and so yeah, that was kind of the situation. And so that caused obviously strain on the obviously causes major strain on the relationship as well, right? Um, uh, of the two sons, probably the one maybe that's more sort of interesting to talk about for our purposes anyway is the one named Boris. Uh, Boris with a Y, Borys. Which is has important Ukrainian and Polish patriotic lore that leads to this name Boris. Conrad basically he uses a different term for it, but according to Conrad, Boris is a dud. Uh,
Oh no. Oh.
right? Not good.
Mm.
He struggled to read. He was struggling to read even by age 8. And Conrad was like, I was reading 2 languages by that time. Um, Boris would fail tests to get into both private school and later to get into the university. He would be pressed into service for World War One. He would come back basically traumatized and unable to really do much of anything successfully or for any long periods of time. Um, so the family situation is not good, and Conrad's not helping, I would say. With his sort of neuroses and attitude and general just I don't even know priggishness, curmudgeonliness, neuroses. Yeah.
His
Um,
attitude, it sounds like
just
he's just
yeah,
not you don't always expect a sailor to
right,
be the easiest person to live with. I think that's pretty understood. Somebody who spent 20 years not rooted with life at home.
right, right.
Uh, there are a bunch of
Yeah.
cliches around it, aren't there? So
Mhm.
and then you have that exacerbated by the temperament of an artist
Right,
who grew
right,
up in a really difficult situation. Yeah,
right, right, right. Yeah,
it's a
nobody's
lot.
had it. Yeah, it is a lot. Absolutely. His own health, this is one of the other number three of the four kind of pieces I want on the table here. His own health is not great, and in particular, the word is gout. Gout, gout, gout. Okay, so every once in a while, gout would flare up and like put him in bed for days. He would sometimes become the pain can be so intense in the fever, he would become delirious sometimes and start sort of shouting in Polish at people. Um, he also had horrible teeth, but would not see a dentist unless something had to be yanked. And his teeth were so bad and he endured so much stress in writing that apparently every long novel he wrote after Lord Jim, which is most of his career, he lost a tooth. Every book it's described as cost him a tooth, right? So you just imagine just like this, like crunching down kind of breaking down nervously and a tooth falling out
Wow.
as he's writing these works. Now this is writing. This is the other part we're going to talk about, sort of in broad strokes. Conrad would often refer to himself as a slow writer. I think it probably felt like that, but I think when you look at his output over a career that's really just 30 years, not the shortest career, but not particularly long either. He writes 20 novels plus countless short stories. That's pretty darn fat. That's pretty darn productive. Um, Yet, this is while being sort of plagued by gout, right? Which, as we mentioned, would often interrupt him. Sometimes severe bouts of depression as well. And then also just his struggles with the English language, right? He didn't just fall off the sea as a master of the English, vernacular.
Mm-hmm.
Especially in the written form. Let me read a little bit.
You mean in the spoken form or in the written form?
Well, both.
Right.
I mean,
okay. Sure.
Yeah. We're gonna talk a little bit about this process because I think it's interesting, and I know that this is something that people always point out about Conrad. It's like, English wasn't his first language. Here's a little bit on here's a little bit on Conrad in English. Quote, when Conrad read aloud to Garnett, this is an editor and friend, from the early chapters of his second novel, An Outcast of the Islands, he mispronounced so many words which he had learned from books but had never heard spoken that Edward could scarcely understand him. Okay. Now, here is a description of how he actually spoke. Let me get to it here. Let's see. Here we go. Though no recording of Conrad's voice was ever made, it is possible to reconstruct his way of speaking from many accounts by his friends. Ford agreed with Galsworthy and Garnett that Conrad's pronunciation was so faulty that he was often very difficult to understand. His use of adverbs and of shall and will was eccentric and arbitrary. He found the English th sound troublesome, and like so many foreigners would say dis and dat. He transposed v and w so that vowel became wowvul, and used a sword as usit a sword. Iodine he pronounced uridine, which his young son once took to mean you are dying. Hugh Clifford, who believed Conrad spoke French more fluently and perfectly than English, heard him describe an editor as a horrible personality. He would say, I thought he was afraid. I thought he was afraid instead of afraid. So I asked him, but I was utterly wrong. And it is uncomfortable. Oh, he would say, he pronounced uncomfortable as uncomfortable. Right. And he frequently had to correct himself. So he would say something like, I bought it. I bought it. Right. So
why did he choose to write in English? Was it for the audience? Okay.
Yeah, this is a very good question. So I think partially I think it is largely for the audience. I think another aspect, he would tell a Polish writer at one point, he says, well, I didn't want to dirty our great Polish literature with my own writing, but I don't think that was actually true. I think it was because the market was there, and he actually ended up reading more in English than he ever had in Polish, right? He kind of starts coming into his own, takes on his own sort of self-education on sailing ships, reading English because that's what was available. So, so I think it's a combination of those things, and I think he was also trying to become an Englishman in a certain sense.
Interesting.
Yeah. Here's a little thing about, now I just said he was trying to become an Englishman. You never really can shed your place of birth, right? So he's always going to be a Polish man. And because of this, and he's in England, he's trying to be English, and he's got this weird career where he's a sailor, but he's also a writer. He always seems, throughout his entire life, to everybody, basically, he always seems like a man out of time. He always seems like a man from someplace else. He's never like home, right? And I got a little bit on that to read real quick. Let's see here. So
I mean, of
Yeah.
the people
So
we've covered, Burroughs was maybe as peripatetic, but in a
yeah.
different way.
Hmm.
But Conrad never had a
Oh,
home, didn't really have a
no.
home. I mean, and I was glancing at the Wikipedia, and it looks like even at this period, they were moving around and
Oh, they were
stuff.
moving around. Yeah, like all through the marriage, he's staying in play. He would get, cheap lodging or cheap rent, I guess, from friends and things like that. It was took a long time before they got really any stability. Here's a little bit about him as just kind of the outsider. Quote, another difficulty was that Conrad retained many characteristics of Polish as well as of French prose style, which provided an exotic foundation and made his English seem unusual even when it was grammatically correct. Polish has longer sentences. It is rich in adjectives, more sedate in pace, less ambiguous, and tends to be rhetorical. I don't know Polish, so I'm going to just take this at its word. Conrad's overfondness for triple parallelism, especially in his early works, such as, saying, I don't know what book this is from, but this is a quote from Conrad, all that mysterious life of the wilderness that stirs in the forest, in the jungles, in the hearts of wild men. Biographers saying that's a sort of a Polish ism to do that kind of thing, as well as Conrad's tendency for rhetorical abstraction, such as, quote, it was the stillness of an implacable force brooding over an inscrutable intention, are things that are more typical of Polish than English and reveals Conrad's Slavic literary legacy, right? So him kind of smuggling in sort of Polish conventions actually, in a way makes for the Conradian
The
style, right?
style. Mm-hmm.
Right. Which
Yeah.
then goes on to influence other people, right? Who are now trying to write like Conrad, not knowing necessarily that they're kind of trying to write like a Polishman. Uh, okay. Here's one quick thing. All right. I'm bouncing around here. 7:05. Oh, we are going long, Kev.
Okay, here we
All
are.
right.
Getting into the fourth hour now, I think.
Yeah, we're getting there for sure. Now, here's a little thing about so when the Narcissus came out, there was a forward to it, which was about Conrad's sort of perspective on art, which is interesting because he wasn't like a successful writer at that point, right? He was building his career and he puts this forward in that's like his perspective on, what the condition of art. But it's kind of interesting. So this is Conrad, and think it gives him a perspective on what he thinks he's doing as a writer. Um, anyway, quote: the artist then, like the thinker or the scientist, seeks the truth and makes his appeal. Impressed by the aspect of the world, the thinker plunges into ideas, the scientist into facts, whence presently emerging they make their appeal to those qualities of our being that fit us best for the hazardous enterprise of living. They speak authoritatively to our common sense, to our intelligence, to our desire of peace, or to our desire of unrest, not seldom to our prejudices, sometimes our fears, often our egoism, but always to our credulity. And their words are heard with reverence, for their concern is with weighty matters, with the cultivation of our minds and the proper care of our bodies, with the attainment of our ambitions, with the perfection of the means and the glorification of our precious aims. It is otherwise with the artist. Confronted by the same enigmatical spectacle, the artist descends within himself, and in that lonely region of stress and strife, if he be deserving and fortunate, he finds the term of his appeal. His appeal is made to our less obvious capacities, to that part of our nature which, because of the warlike conditions of existence, is necessarily kept out of sight within the more resisting and hard qualities, like the vulnerable body within a steel armor. His appeal is less loud, more profound, less distinct, more stirring, and sooner forgotten. Yet its effect endures forever. Okay, so that's what Conrad thinks the writer is doing, or the artist, more properly speaking, is doing. Now, I think I want to talk briefly about Lord Jim. Okay, so we're going to talk about one or two books. We're going to talk about a couple of his famous friends. We're getting there. Lord Jim is, I had some passages. Well, let's talk about what it is first. Okay. From Wikipedia, just a summary, because I think Lord Jim is one of maybe his 3 or 4 best books. And I want people to read it if they haven't already. From Wikipedia, An early and primary event in the story of Lord Jim is the abandonment of a passenger ship in distress by its crew, including a young British seaman named Jim. He is publicly censured for this action, and the novel follows his later attempts at coming to terms with himself and his past and seeking redemption and acceptance. So you have this sort of swashbuckling tale about, a ship sinking and then the crew abandoning it, but then it doesn't sink and all of that. But the book is really about exorcising the guilt that's left behind of that. That's what I think raises it out of just being an adventure story about the sea, right? This book, like all of his other work, was based on actual incidents. In 1880, there'd been a ship carrying 1,000 Muslim pilgrims from Singapore to Mecca eventually, right? And there'd been an accident, and the white officers and crew abandoned the ship. The problem was that the ship didn't sink. And a first mate at the time of the desertion, this guy, Augustine Podmore Williams, who became the model for Lord Jim, Conrad had some sympathies for this guy, right? Despite taking the stand that this abandoning your ship is an awful thing to do, he still felt sympathies for this guy who had to live with this guilt, right? And this is a fascinating part of Conrad, and the reason I also wanted to talk about Lord Jim. We have to remember, Conrad is born. Remember that poem that Apollo, his father, wrote about him, about how you're a Pole, and sort of this notion of like, we have to fight for our freedom, we have to fight for our sovereignty, we have to push back against suppression. And then Conrad just leaves. And we can make all the comments we want about that was the smart thing to do, but there's guilt that comes with that too. Right. Should I have stayed and tried to fight for my homeland and live out the fate that, my father wanted for me? Am I letting down the spirit of my father, who went through all of this stuff, right, to try and make it, And so I think we see Conrad sort of putting that guilt into different guises throughout his work and trying to deal with it, right?
That makes sense.
Because he leaves Poland. He abandons his land. He
doesn't even write in it. Yeah.
Right. Right. And so, so I think that's interesting. I think that's why part of the reason why Lord Jim is so emotionally potent, because Conrad's really wrestling with a feeling. It's not a criticism so much of, like, in Heart of Darkness, there's criticisms about the Empire and things like that. This is really like a figuring out a criticism he has of himself, though there's some of that in Heart of Darkness as well. I think, let me see. Okay, I'm going to read one passage from Lord Jim. Okay. And part of the thing, I'm trying to convince people who haven't read any Conrad why he's worth reading. And I'm going to show you in this like page how effective he is at introducing a character and getting you to see a character, who down into like what they really are, and giving you their whole life basically in a page. Okay. This is about just a quick brief thing. His character is Montague Brierly, and this is a captain in the merchant service who is partially responsible for figuring out what the judgment on Lord Jim should be, right? What should we do with this guy who abandoned his post, right? Montague Brierly is one of the guys who's involved in this decision. Think of him as like a juror on a jury, right? Montague Brierly, let's see. He seemed consumedly bored by the honor thrust upon him. He had never in his life made a mistake, never had an accident, never a mishap, never a check in his steady rise, and he seemed to be one of those lucky fellows who knew nothing of indecision, much less of self-mistrust. At 32, he had one of the best commands going in the Eastern trade, and what's more, he thought a lot of what he had. There's nothing like it in the world, and I suppose if you had asked him point blank, he would have confessed that in his opinion, there was not such another commander. The choice had fallen upon the right man. The rest of mankind that did not command the 16-knot steel steamer Osa were rather poor creatures. He had saved lives at sea, had rescued ships in distress, had a gold chronometer presented to him by the underwriters, and a pair of binoculars with a suitable inscription from some foreign government in commemoration of those services. He was acutely aware of his merits and of his rewards. I liked him well enough, though some I know, meek, friendly men at that, couldn't stand him at any price. I haven't the slightest doubt he considered himself vastly my superior. Indeed, had you been emperor of East and West, you would not have ignored your inferiority in his presence, but I couldn't get up any real sentiment of offense. He did not despise me for anything I could help, for anything I was, don't you know? I was a negligible quantity simply because I was not the fortunate man of earth, not Montague Brierly in command of the OSA, not the owner of an inscribed gold chronometer and of silver-mounted binoculars testifying to the excellence of my seamanship and to my indomitable pluck, not possessed of an acute sense of my merits and my rewards, besides the love and worship of a black retriever, the most wonderful of its kind, for never was a man such loved thus by such a dog. No doubt to have all this forced upon you was exasperating enough, but when I reflected that I was associated in these fatal disadvantages with 1,200 millions of other more or less human beings, I found I could bear my share of his good-natured and contemptuous pity for the sake of something indefinite and attractive in the man. As I looked at him flanking on one side of the unassuming, pale-faced magistrate who presided at the inquiry, his self-satisfaction presented to me and to the world a surface as hard as granite. He committed suicide very soon after.
Whoa.
And then he never explains why he committed suicide. It's just like you have this entire arrangement of like the perfect man, right? And then he committed suicide. And then Conrad just lets you live with that.
Yeah, but it's a perfect man in his own mind.
Right.
So,
yeah.
I mean,
so what is that?
It's very biting. Very incisive and, in fact, almost a pretty cruel way of describing a character.
It is. Yeah.
So
it's very cool. And Conrad's always doing that. If you read through his stuff, like anytime he introduces a character, it's like, it's noteworthy. It stays, right?
We're well into a fourth hour, and I can just see you get all jacked up because you got to read some prose. Why are we doing this show? This is why. And if you're still listening, I hope you are. Brad hopes you are. Please do support the podcast. If you're into this is a core episode. This is at the heart of what we do. We will be doing an additional 20-30 minutes for Patreon on the After Dark. We'll tease that again before we close this one down. Just want to say, whether you're on board for Patreon or not, you can support the pod in lots of different ways. Tell your friends. If everybody listening to this podcast right now tells 5 people about it, we're going to have no problems this year. Give us 5 stars on Spotify, iTunes, whatever else. Go and subscribe on YouTube. It's easy to find. Just Art of Darkness podcast on YouTube. We got to get those numbers up because they're already running ads on our stuff.
Right.
And until we get a certain number of subscribers, we don't see any of that. So come on now. It's the least you can do. Yeah. And we did break a certain milestone. We've got over 1,000 subscribers now on Spotify,
cool.
Which is outstanding. And hey, shout out to all the Spotify people. But hey, if you're there, take 5 minutes, go over, subscribe to the YouTube. You don't even have to look at our faces if you're not into it. Just do it to boost the numbers, help us out. Mwah, we love all of you. Thank you for listening. Brad, you're crushing it. I am so into this. I've learned so much. I have a feeling you're going to be bringing us around home. And
we're getting there.
I am. Take it away, my friend.
Yes, absolutely. So here's another thing about Conrad. He had very many famous friends, or would come to have very many famous friends whose names you will know, and the ones that you don't know are actually almost as interesting as the ones you do. He was friends with H.G. Wells, right? This starts out guy who wrote The Invisible Man and War of the Worlds, and also wrote like a book that like repopularized the sort of pedestrian study of history. Very interesting guy in a lot of ways. Wrote a dictionary at one point.
It came from a lot of money. His grandfather invented the well. No, of course not. Yeah,
that's hilarious. Get a nickel every time you draw a bucket of water. So Conrad and he become friends. Wells had written an anonymous positive review of a Conrad novel. They became buddies, and this was a very interesting point because one thing that Conrad got criticized for in his writing and sometimes in his personal life was for how pessimistic he was. Most of his works are fairly pessimistic. And they range. A Heart of Darkness is intensely pessimistic, right? Now, Wells told him at one point, well, that he was in a letter said he was a pessimist. And Conrad said, you to Wells, he said, no, 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 you don't understand. Wells, you don't care for humanity, but you think they are to be improved. I love humanity, but know that they are not. Right. So Conrad's thing is, I don't think you make them better or improve them or
know that they can't be improved.
Right. So
that is intense.
Right. Yeah. That's a different and that's an interesting juxtaposition, right? Because H.G. Wells is part of like the technocrat, like, you know, he's a sign of progress, right? Anyway, they did like each other. Conrad would dedicate The Secret Agent to H.G. Wells. Conrad was good friends with Stephen Crane, author of The Red Badge of Courage, American writer. They meet in 1897. Crane loves Conrad and his work, and Conrad loves Stephen Crane. Unfortunately, you know, Stephen Crane, famous as people probably know, dies in the year 1900 at just 28 years of age. So, you know, it's not a long-term relationship, but it was powerful while it lasted. The last letter that Stephen Crane ever wrote was, in fact, to a man named Sanford Bennett, who's a really interesting character we're not going to dig into, but Wikipedia Sanford Bennett, people who are listening to this, interesting character. Basically, Stephen Crane's last letter was to the Stanford Bennett guy asking for any guidance about helping Conrad with his gout. That was the last thing Stephen Crane wrote as a letter.
Interesting.
Ford Madox Ford was a good friend, also known as Ford Madox Hoofer. Most English writer best known for the novel The Good Soldier, and more so for being the editor of the English Review, which the first edition of brought together Thomas Hardy, Henry James, Conrad, John Galsworthy, the author of the Forsyte Saga, W.H. Hudson, and H.G. Wells into one volume in 1908. This was it's kind of a big literary event. I mean, it's before all the literary modernism stuff really kicks off, but in 1908, this was a big deal, this journal coming out. Ford would become a very close friend of Conrad, and Conrad would even live at one of Ford's homes, the famous Pent Farm, where the Conrads reside for a number of years. And living there got Conrad close to all of these people, so they could visit each other for dinner. Stephen Crane and Ford Madox Ford and H.G. Wells, Henry James, and some others. And then Conrad and Ford would actually become literary collaborators. They wrote a few novels together, The Inheritors, Romance, The Nature of the Crime. Most critics believe that none of the books they wrote together were as good as the books they wrote separately. So it wasn't very beneficial, apparently, and I haven't read any of these, but that seems to be the consensus. Conrad didn't seem to like Ford as much as Ford liked Conrad. Conrad would kind of diminish Ford's talents when he was out of earshot. But at the same time, Conrad would end up relying on him for money and housing. And Conrad would also kind of lean on Ford to like stimulate his creative powers and conversation. There was a time when they were serializing, which book was it? It might have been Nostromo, when Nostromo was being serialized, where Conrad couldn't keep up, and Ford ended up like writing some passages, and it went unacknowledged for years. Ford, though, Ford is an interesting character too, because he comes out of nowhere. He writes the English Review, and then he thinks he's like the best literary mind in England, because he's the editor of a successful issue of a journal, right? And he's like, suddenly he's wearing furs and like just making catch his ass of himself.
Oh, jeez.
Right? Yeah. So it's just kind of funny. So Ford and Conrad's relationship kind of came and went in terms of intensity. They had some fallings out. The big kind of falling out came from two reasons. One was Ford had Conrad's contributing to was serializing something in the English Review and couldn't keep up. And so Ford wrote publicly that Conrad couldn't keep up because he was sick, right? It was written in nice terms, like, unfortunately, in this issue of the English Review, Conrad, but Conrad took offense to it. Like, he did not want it said in public that he was ill. He was very upset about it. Also, he found out that one of the financiers of the English Review was a Russian. So and he did not like Russians. He would always say he had no problem with Russians, but like if it ever came up, he was no. That guy's a Russian. We'll talk a little bit slightly about his love for the Russian writer Turgenev, though. Conrad would become friends with Henry James, brother of William James, American author of Daisy Miller, Portrait of a Lady, Story of a Year, a bunch of other stuff. Henry James was kind of considered the sort of American literary genius of his generation by many people and the generation following. Conrad himself saw Miller as the only living writer in English who was his equal. And
Miller, or
I'm sorry, Miller.
Yeah,
James. Sorry, Conrad saw Henry. Thank you. Conrad saw Henry.
Yeah, James.
Conrad saw Henry James, the only living writer who was his equal. They weren't as close of friends as some of these other people, but it's just kind of interesting that he was there. Henry James did help Conrad get the Royal Literary Fund award, which was about $30,000 at the time. So it had seriously helpful when you're a guy who's, asking for handouts from everybody. And so Henry James generally was helpful in his career. Now, there's another guy who's fascinating that I'd never heard of. I'd heard of all of these people and learned a little bit about them. But there was a guy named Cunningham Graham who... Very interesting. Okay. So he's the first socialist member of the UK Parliament, founder of the Scottish Labour Party. He was a journalist. And most interesting to Conrad, he was an adventurer who'd had a refined European education and then went off to Argentina to make a fortune cattle ranching, right? He'd gone searching for a forbidden city in Morocco, disguised as a sheik, so he could get through the various villages and things. He'd become a friend of Buffalo Bill in Texas and taught sword fighting in Mexico City, right? And so when Conrad met this guy, he just loved him. He loved this like adventurous life that the guy had lived, for sure. And Cunningham Graham, sort of in reciprocity, loved Conrad's work. And actually had reached out to Conrad when Conrad's short story An Outpost of Progress had come out. This was a book that was a story that was also set in the Congo, kind of a precursor of Heart of Darkness. When that story came out, Cunningham Graham reached out to Conrad and said, "This is amazing. I'd like to meet you." And I'm sure he was interested in a report from the Congo. An adventurous guy like that, probably the first thing he ever read that might have been an indication of what was happening on that uncharted piece of the map. Graham would become the inspiration for a major character in the novel Nostromo. And we haven't talked much about that book, but it's definitely worth. I plan to read it. It's one that I haven't actually read, and I would love to read it when I've got a minute. One thing worth saying about Nostromo is F. Scott Fitzgerald is quoted as saying, "I would have rather have written Nostromo than any other novel." So it's a big deal. It was important to all, it was important. It was hugely influential, obviously. Since Fitzgerald is arguably more influential than Conrad, right? And this is the novel he looks up to the most.
And we will be doing part 1 of Fitzgerald here live in St. Paul, Minnesota this June. I cannot wait. It's going to be fun. Yeah. Stay tuned for that, for details. Yeah.
Let me give you a quick, this is a letter. So here's another thing that Conrad liked about Cunningham Graham. Cunningham Graham, despite all of his adventures, was a pessimist and probably a misanthrope, and didn't favor progress, saw really no future. And so I think Conrad saw him as a fellow traveler, like in that regard as well. We've both seen the world, and we both know that on that uncharted piece of the map is a heart of darkness. Right? We both know this. Here's a letter that Conrad wrote to Cunningham Graham. Quote, "Faith is a myth and beliefs shift like mists on the shore. Thoughts vanish. Words once pronounced die. And the memory of yesterday is as shadowy as the hope of tomorrow. In this world, as I have known it, we are made to suffer without the shadow of a reason, of a cause, or of guilt. There is no morality, no knowledge, and no hope. There's only the consciousness of ourselves, which drives us about a world that, is always but a vain and floating appearance. A moment, a twinkling of an eye, and nothing remains but a clot of mud, of cold mud, of dead mud cast into black space, rolling around an extinguished sun. Nothing, neither thought, nor sound, nor soul. Nothing. That's Conrad
Mm.
in a personal letter. So, yeah, I mean, that's something you could have pulled from Kurtz's report, 17-page report that said exterminate all the brutes, right? Like, yeah.
You can tell it's somebody who's suffered from depression.
Yeah, right,
Yeah,
right.
right.
And physical pain and
above average, suffering.
Yeah, 100%. Now, I want to talk, we're in a part of my notes called Late Conrad. So, we're getting there. Okay. So starting with the book The Secret Agent, I think we find ourselves in late Conrad, mature Conrad. This comes out in 1907. So when Conrad is, say, 40, what would he be? 50, about 50 years old. There's like 9 novels still after this, and some of them are quite good. So he's a very productive, he's a busy man. Again, despite him saying how slow he is as a writer. I think when he says I'm a slow writer, I think what he means by that is I write for 12 hours straight and I only get a couple pages out of it. But then I just do that every day until the book's done. Right. Mm-hmm. And so that does feel slow if you work all day and you get a page or two, but you keep doing it, it builds up. Now The Secret Agent. Some people will claim that The Secret Agent is Conrad's most accomplished novel. I don't know what that means, but like, what does it mean when someone says accomplished? I'm not quite sure exactly.
Fully realized, you're the marries different parts of like style with originality, genius, and then also story.
Yeah.
Every character fully real, that would be but it can mean anything, right? What does it even? Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I've read it. I do think it is a great work of fiction. Is it as good as Heart of Darkness? It's not doing the same. It's not trying to do the same thing as Heart of Darkness. So I have a hard time comparing them. It is great and it's good. It's a worthwhile read. It's also entertaining, and it's not as dark as Heart of Darkness. The basic premise is that a bomb. The basic premise is that a bomb goes off. Right. You've got this lazy smut peddler guy. He literally owns like a kind of a porn shop for 1907 London. Right. And he's also employed as a spy by a foreign embassy. And, by some foreign, he's living in London, but some foreign embassy employs him as a spy. Out of fear that he's going to lose his paid position. So a new regime comes in the embassy and they really they're like, listen, you haven't done anything for us. We need you to stir some stuff up. Or else you're going to lose this. And he's getting like a monthly stipend he'd been like, doing like organizing. He's part of like an anarchist group, but the anarchist group doesn't really do anything but meet and complain, right?
Nothing changes.
Right. Yeah. So now what do they want him to attack? Like, they basically say, like, you need to set off a bomb. And we don't necessarily want to kill anybody or anything, but what we need to do is stir up some chaos and it's interesting because it's kind of complicated. They're not trying to undermine England entirely. The idea is this country, which goes unnamed, is seeing that basically England is becoming liberal and open, and that's making people on the continent want to also become more liberal and more open, right? And fewer restrictions and this sort of thing. So what this foreign government wants our hero, quote unquote, to do is set off a bomb so that England kind of tightens down again, right? Starts to kind of rein things in, try to get things under control. These crazy anarchists are blowing stuff up, right? So the smut peddler decides he has to do this because he needs his monthly stipend, and he gets involved with an associate that's known only as the Professor. And the Professor is I mean, if Kurtz is one of the best uh, villains in literary history, the professor's up there too. Like the professor is a great character. He's played by Robin Williams in one of the film adaptations, actually.
Uh-huh.
Um, and yeah, so I'm gonna read you. I'm gonna read you one bit. This is gonna be Verloc getting his assignment. I was gonna read the bit that the professor is talking, where we meet the professor, but it's so scattered around. This is the thing. Well, no, you know what? I will read that because there's one good paragraph. But first, I'm going to read you Verloc, who is the lazy smut peddler, getting his assignment to bomb something. And it's quite interesting as sort of commentary.
Reed, I'm going to be topping my water off as you do. All right.
Copy that.
Bring it on.
All right. So this is the sort of administrator who is sort of an ambassador, and he's telling Verloc, who is our lazy smut peddler, that he's got to blow something up. Quote, "This is what you should try for. An attempt upon a crowned head or on a president." Sorry, excuse me. An attempt upon a crowned head or on a president is sensational enough in a way, but not so much as it used to be. It has entered into the general conception of the existence of all chiefs of state. It is almost conventional, especially since so many presidents have been assassinated. Now let us take an outrage upon, say, a church. Horrible enough at first sight, no doubt, and yet not so effective as a person of an ordinary mind might think. No matter how revolutionary and anarchist in inception, there would be fools enough to give such an outrage the character of a religious manifestation, and that would detract from the especial alarming significance we wish to give to the act. A murderous attempt on a restaurant or a theater would suffer in the same way from the suggestion of non-political passion, the exasperation of a hungry man, an act of social revenge. All this is used up. It is no longer instructive as an object lesson in revolutionary anarchism. Every newspaper has ready-made phrases to explain such manifestations away. I am about to give you the philosophy of bomb throwing from my point of view, from the point of view you pretend to have been serving for the last 11 years. I will try not to talk above your head. The sensibilities of the class you are attacking are soon blunted. Property seems to them an indestructible thing. You can't count upon their emotions either of pity or fear for very long. A bomb outrage to have any influence on public opinion now must go beyond the intentions of vengeance or terrorism. It must be purely destructive. It must be that, and only that, beyond the faintest suspicion of any other object. You anarchists should make it clear that you are perfectly determined to make a clean sweep of the whole social creation. But how to get to that appallingly absurd notion to the heads of the middle classes so that there should be no mistake? That's the question. By directing your blows at something outside the ordinary passions of humanity is the answer. Of course, there is art. A bomb in the National Gallery would make some noise. But it would not be serious enough. Art has never been their fetish. It's like breaking a few back windows in a man's house. Whereas if you want to make him really sit up, you must try at least to raise the roof. There would be some screaming, of course, but from whom? Artists? Art critics and such like people of no account? Nobody minds what they say. But there is learning. Science. Any imbecile that has got an income believes in that. He does not know why, but he believes it matters somehow. Science is the sacrosanct fetish. All the damned professors are radical at heart. Let them know that their great panjandrum has got to go too, to make room for the future of the proletariat. A howl from all these intellectual idiots is bound to help forward the labors of the Milan Conference. They will be writing to the papers. Their indignation would be above suspicion. No material interests being openly at stake, and it will alarm every selfishness of the class which should be impressed. They believe that in some mysterious way, science is at the source of their material prosperity. They do. And the absurd ferocity of such a demonstration will affect them more profoundly than the mangling of a whole street or theater, full of their own kind. To that last, they can always say, oh, it's mere class hate. But what is one to say to an act of destructive ferocity so unthinkable as to be incomprehensible, inexplicable, almost unthinkable, in fact, mad? Madness alone is truly terrifying, inasmuch as you cannot placate it either by threats, persuasion, or bribes. So this foreign government wants our lazy smut peddler to blow up the Greenwich Observatory to attack the very concept of science at the heart of progress in the 20th
It's still
century.
called Greenwich Mean Time.
Yeah, right.
Right?
Yeah.
It's where time is marked in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Very intense
Yeah. So
symbolism there.
they're
Yeah.
trying to send a bomb right into the heart of that, right? And
Mm.
I just think that's very like after a century of terrorism and all its forms that we've seen since this is a very interesting it's a very interesting perspective to have on this. And it's a book that has been referred to like apparently, I don't remember this, but apparently like around 9/11 there was a lot of discussion about this book as like, can we understand something about the motivations of the terrorists through
Interesting.
the secret
Well,
agent?
and once again, we're right back on the Thames. I mean, the Greenwich is right there. So yeah, very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, this
Good
is
pass, good passage.
Yeah, it is a little on the long side, but bear with me. Here's another one. So this isn't our lazy smut peddler meeting him, but another guy in his fraternity of anarchists. He stumbles upon this guy named the Professor, and the Professor is a bomb maker. And so if you're an anarchist or another political activist in London and you want a bomb, he's the guy that you go see. Now, it's tricky to know exactly which parts to read because it's so scattered. But here's the thing. The Professor will give a bomb to anyone. He doesn't care. He doesn't care who gets the bomb. And he's trying to explain this to the anarchist that to him it does not matter because he's the perfect anarchist, right? So to him, for the purposes of anarchy, of bringing down the system, it doesn't matter who has the bomb.
Some men just want to watch the world burn.
Exactly. And then I don't even think I'm going to read a passage because I can kind of explain it. Now he has this other thing. I will end up reading one paragraph that's really good. But okay, this is the other thing. All of the police and all of the anarchists and political activists know who the Professor is, but nobody does anything about him. And the reason they don't do anything about him is because he always has a suicide vest on. And he has a little India rubber ball that he can squeeze. And when he squeezes it within 10 seconds, a bomb with basically a sphere of influence of about 60 yards will go off and it will kill him and everybody.
That is an incredible character. This is like this is kind of like a comic book movie.
A bit, right? Yeah. And it's funny. What I'm not capturing here is the humor because it is kind of funny and ironic. It's menacing and a little scary.
Suicide vests are hilarious.
No, not that part.
No, okay. All right.
Other parts. Well, you get this kind of like lazy, portly
humor is subjective, Brad.
That's true. I find it a lot of the book quite ironic and quite funny. But not but I think this is a great and he will talk about the fact this is why the police don't do anything about him, right? And there's in fact a police officer who's a major character, this guy named Chief Inspector Heat, who not to give too much away, he's very concerned that the Professor not be involved because he doesn't want to deal with the Professor, right? Like you don't want to be the guy that has to go apprehend him, right? And he walks around with this knowledge, the Professor does, that he's basically untouchable. And why is he untouchable? Because he's willing to play the game all the way to the end, right? And then his point also is because then one of the other anarchists says, somebody should just shoot you from a distance. And then he says, well, the problem with that is they would have to go against their whole system to do that. You would have to, it wouldn't become a self-defense thing. It would become murder. And then you would have to go against, and then his point is and then I still get what I want, right? Because that one guy had to go against the system to do it.
It's like a character that's a logic problem.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. It's kind of
like brilliant. The Riddler or the Joker.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. Now, and then he's arguing with this anarchist, right? And he says, this is kind of good. He's arguing with this anarchist, right? He says, the professor does, "You are not a bit better than the forces arrayed against you, than the police, for instance. The other day I came suddenly upon Chief Inspector Heat at the corner of Tottenham Court Road. He looked at me very steadily, but I did not look at him. Why should I give him more than a glance? He was thinking of many things, of his superiors, of his reputation, of the law courts, of his salary, of newspapers, of 100 things. But I was thinking only of my perfect detonator." So his whole point, like his whole thing is he's narrowed his political philosophy and everything down to, if you build the perfect detonator, it's entangled with everything else that he wants to have happen. It's really expertly done, honestly.
Wow, I have so much reading to do for the pod and other things, but this is really interesting. This sounds like a very good novel. Yeah.
It's quite good. Yeah. And there's so much intrigue. It's layers upon layers. Everybody has personal motivations and then public motivations, and they're all sort of like the kind of the drama of the book is when they all come into conflict with each other, right? Okay, so moving along. Now, as he's putting these books out, 1907, Secret Agent comes out and it sells reasonably well, and things are kind of progressing. As we said earlier, his career kind of progresses more or less linearly until he's eventually quite successful and quite well known. But the critical success kind of lags the commercial success in a way. The novels Nostromo, even The Secret Agent, the political novel he writes after The Secret Agent, Under Western Eyes, these go basically under or unremarked by the critics. So question is sort of like, okay, why is Conrad important? So the critics at the time didn't really acknowledge him in a way. So and we say he's an important writer. What does that even mean, right? So let's think about this. Kevin, can you tell me another writer of the 20th century who is important, who is also known for his adventurous masculine life?
Hemingway.
Okay. Here's what Hemingway had to say about Conrad. And Hemingway, I think, is indisputably important in English language writing, right? I mean, I don't even think we have to
nobody. Yeah, right.
He said that he would have Hemingway said that he would have gladly pursued T.S. Eliot with a sausage grinder if, quote, grinding Mr. Eliot into a fine dry powder and sprinkling that powder over Mr. Conrad's grave would bring Conrad back to life. Hemingway would say in a essay called Conrad, Optimist and Moralist, that came out shortly after Conrad died. Hemingway says, quote, "It is fashionable among my friends to disparage Conrad. It is even necessary. Living in a world of literary politics where one wrong opinion often proves fatal, one writes carefully. It is agreed by most of the people I know that Conrad is a bad writer, just as it is agreed that T.S. Eliot is a good writer. And now Conrad is dead, and I wish to God they would have taken some great acknowledged technician of a literary figure and left him to write his bad stories." Right. Or sorry. Yeah. Now he's basically saying, I wish they would have taken T.S. Eliot instead of Conrad.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
And T.S. Eliot, we're all, come T.S. Eliot, or T.S. Eliot, right. The Wasteland.
Sure. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. So, here's another thing about the direct influences of Conrad on Hemingway. And what I've read of Conrad, I think you don't really see that influence on Hemingway, because Hemingway is sort of archetypally or sort of famously known for these very efficient sentences. And I don't think Conrad is efficient in that same way. There's a little bit of an ornate quality to a lot of Conrad's work. So it's not easy to see the influence, but let me read this a little bit. So this is from an essay by where did it go? This is from an essay called Hemingway and Conrad by a gentleman named oh shoot, what is I think I may have lost his name. Apologies.
No worries.
Anyway, Hemingway, quote, "Hemingway worked 10 months before he wrote the final ending for A Farewell to Arms," one of his most famous books, However, what Reynolds, this is a person Reynolds is a earlier reviewer and critic and scholar of Hemingway. However, what Reynolds does not explain and what the manuscript evidence does not reveal is that after those 10 months of frustration, Hemingway returned to his source for the ending of The Sun Also Rises, working that summer in 1929 as he told George Plimpton at getting the words right for the ending of his new novel. At this time, Hemingway read, remembered, or perhaps in his search, reread Conrad's short story, A Smile of Fortune, discovering the image which so brilliantly concludes A Farewell to Arms. So, in A Farewell to Arms, he says, basically at the end, I don't know if it's exactly the end, but it's near the end. Hemingway says, Conrad says, the garden at the end of A Smile of Fortune, Conrad says, the garden was one mass of gloom, like a cemetery of flowers buried in the darkness, and she in the chair seemed to muse mournfully over the extinction of light and color. Only whiffs of heavy scent passed like wandering fragrant souls. Of that departed multitude of blossoms, I talked volubly, jocularly, persuasively, tenderly. I talked in a subdued tone. To a listener, it would have sounded like a murmur of a pleading lover. Whenever I paused expectantly, there was only a deep silence. It was like offering food to a seated statue. Okay, that last sentence. It was like offering food to a seated statue. The final ending for A Farewell to Arms basically ends on the same thing. He says, employing oh my gosh, did I not get, oh shoot. No. He says, but after I had gotten them out and shut the door and turned off the light, it wasn't any good. It was like saying goodbye to a statue. After that, I went out and left the hospital and walked back to the hotel in the rain. That's the last sentence. So the second to last sentence of one of Hemingway's most acclaimed novels borrows the image directly from Conrad, from a story we know he was reading while he was working on it, right? So these influences are like small scale and large scale on Hemingway and others. And Fitzgerald says, there's no novel I would have rather written than Nostromo. Okay. We're getting close to the end. In 1914, I just have to put this in here. 1914, the most uneventful year in European history, as everyone knows. Conrad goes to Poland with his children for the first time in 21 years. While he's there, a little thing called the Great War breaks out. So while they're bouncing around Krakow and then eventually making it to Vienna, they are basically watching Eastern and Central Europe descend into war while he's on holiday. They see soldiers returning from the front. His wife, Jessie, sees a barrel full of limbs in the street. They see the whole thing. And he's like, he doesn't need, it's just like, there's a certain kind of silliness to it. Like, not silliness, but like Conrad didn't think the Great War was going to happen. When he heard about Franz Ferdinand being assassinated, he's like, who's that guy? That guy doesn't matter. Nothing's going to happen. Right. And he just goes to Poland. His big fear about World War I is that basically there were people in Poland who thought this might be an opportunity for Polish sovereignty and independence. And Conrad was worried that the Polish people would basically just be sacrificed on this war, just be used for cannon fodder, right? Anyway, they hide out in a Polish mountain resort for a while, and then eventually kind of smuggle themselves back or sneak back across the border and get themselves back to England. But for several months during World War I, they are near the battle. He has a couple other novels come out after this. A big one that was quite popular and really got attention in America was the novel Victory, which is quite good. Not going to go into depth on it because, like I said, he has a lot of novels. This is a more of a seafaring one. There's some sort of espionage and intrigue, and there's a dispute over a bat guano deposit on an island and all these things. It's very kind of pulpy, but with Conrad's erudition and depth. Victory brings up one thing about his life that's interesting. We talked about his sort of sexual hangups, and it's not clear what was going on there exactly. In Victory, Conrad has a character, a villain who is pretty clearly homosexual, though it's not stated.
Mhm.
And this gives us maybe our sense of what Conrad's attitudes towards homosexuality were. I mean, you make your villain the only gay character you've ever had, and your oeuvre is a nasty villain. That says one thing, right? Um, and Conrad may have to make disparaging comments about Oscar Wilde and some other well-known, homosexual men of his day. Um, and yet, interestingly enough, he had a lot of gay friends. Um,
Hmm.
some of which he would have known, clearly knew. His the man who translated his work into French was gay. Hugh Walpole, who became a good friend of his, was gay. Roger Casement, who we've mentioned before, the man he met in the Congo, was gay. Andre Gide, who was a friend of Oscar Wilde, and whose most famous book is called Corydon, which is basically a series of Socratic dialogues about homosexuality and pederasty. Um, he and Conrad were good friends. Conrad was very good friends with a man named Norman Douglas, who most people don't, it's not a name that rings a bell for most people. Norman Douglas was an English writer about 10 years younger than Conrad. He'd moved to Capri, where Conrad met him on holiday, and buddied around Capri with, like, opium addicts and the sort of the riffraff. In 1916, Norman Douglas was jailed on sexual assault charges on a 16-year-old boy. And when this happened, Norman Douglas and Conrad were such good friends that Douglas's son, Robin, would often stay with the Conrads on school holiday. And so when Douglas was jailed, Conrad like took over taking care of Norman Douglas's son for a while.
Hmm. Wow.
Right. So he clearly knew what was going, and he had a sense of
Sure.
like, we have to protect Robin, the boy, from knowing what his dad did too. Like, we have to keep it like secret from the family. So he has a complicated relationship. Like a lot of people, I think you have one opinion about a phenomenon out there in the world, but when it's in your personal life, it's very different, right? You know a person who is that thing. So just a kind of interesting sort of note. He does have an affair with a woman named Jane Anderson. Uh, they meet in 1916, and she's about 30 years younger than him.
Hmm.
She is an American. She's from Atlanta. She came to England as a journalist and kind of I think it's fair to say she sort of slept her way into positions within sort of English journalism and public eye. And she had this kind of American free spiritedness that, English, very proper, upright Englishmen found like irresistible. And Conrad, despite the fact that she may have been the second person Conrad ever slept with, Conrad was not immune to her charms. Um,
I wonder if he really only slept with those two women.
Well,
I
this is
highly
the
doubt
thing.
it.
I
But
think
yeah.
so. I think that's probably true, and I think he's just better at concealing it, or whatever, than some of maybe our other subjects who are a little bit more free talking about it. Um, the one thing that was kind of screwy with this one is like she had asked to through some connections she had to meet Conrad. She just wanted to meet Conrad, the great writer, and she came out and she eventually became like a friend of the family, and she was around all of the time, and like she was friends with Conrad's wife, and it got very weird. And then just like at some point they started sleeping together, and then of course Jesse found out about it and she was outraged. um it was uh, it's just something that happened. It's kind of there. Jane Anderson is an interesting figure. She was like a family friend of Wild Bill Cody, which is interesting. Yeah, she's a bit of a trip. And you can kind of imagine her. You could look a picture of her up. Jane Anderson's kind of hard to Google, but if you look Jane Anderson 1916 or something, you'd probably find it. And you can just imagine her just showing up in sort of wartime England and just driving everybody a little bit crazy. Like, just the women kind of being, oh my gosh, clutching their pearls, and the men
Yes,
getting all
sure.
like, yeah, getting all stressed
No.
out. Yeah. Um, Okay, we're getting very close now. We're into the final years, the final years of Conrad. Conrad would, as I said, spend his final years, I don't know about quite rich, but doing pretty well. The Rescue, basically his last novel, would sell 50,000 copies, which is a lot. Um, he'd become friends with T.E. Lawrence, which is just kind of interesting. And T.E. Lawrence would try and tell him that all of the Lawrence of Arabia stuff was all BS. Um, uh, Conrad would wait around for a Nobel Prize. He thought that he was going to get it on at least two occasions, and then he lost to another Polish writer, which was very confusing and frustrating for him. Um, he would make these just terrible failures of forays onto the stage and screen. He was not well adept at writing for the theater. They tried to turn The Secret Agent into a silent film, and they like drained all of the humor out of it, and it just didn't work at all.
Yeah.
Just didn't understand how. Just and that's fine. Just new medium. It wasn't his thing. But he would become celebrated in America as well. And you know, last few years there's kind of an uneventful sort of elder statesman of literature. I want to give you a description since we've given a couple physical descriptions of him. I want to give you a description by his sculptor. So a man, I'm blanking on his name right now, but it'll be right here. This is again from the biography. And I just thought it was a kind of lovely description of a man, it is in his final years and days. His sculptor was named Epstein. No relation, I don't think. And this is he's sculpting a bust of Conrad. Epstein noticed Conrad's hooded eyelids and deep-rooted sense of despair about his work, and he would have this to say, quote, Conrad had a demon expression in the left eye, while his right eye was smothered by a drooping lid, but the eye glowed with a great intensity of feeling. The drooping, weary lids intensified the expression of brooding thought. The whole head revealed the man who had suffered much. Conrad gave me a feeling of defeat, but defeat met with courage. He was crippled with rheumatism, crotchety, nervous, and ill. He said to me, I am finished. There was pathos in his pulling out of a drawer his last manuscript to show me that he was still at work. There was no triumph in his manner, however, and he said that he did not know whether he would ever finish it. I am played out, he said, played out. He appeared a lonely, brooding man with none too pleasant thoughts. Okay, so then during this kind of sculpting process, and we're coming right to the end here, I'm just going to read this. I think it's quite good. Epstein's the sculptor making the final bust of Conrad. Epstein mentioned that Conrad, who suffered from hypertension related to gout, had had a mild heart attack while he was posing, and complaints about ill health, which made him savage, misanthropic, and pessimistic, as well as expressions of longing for death, became frequent during the last years of Conrad's life. On November 12th, 1923, Dr. Fox of nearby Ashford told him in his horrid way that he had, like Ransom in the Shadow Line, one of Conrad's last books, a, quote, flabby heart. Though Conrad feared a breakdown in health and a lingering end, he also believed that gouty people went out suddenly. A week later, he described himself to Hugh Walpole as a tottering, staggering, shuddering, shivering, crocky, seedy, gouty wretch. Jesse noted that in 1924, he suffered such severe fits of depression that he could scarcely rouse himself to speak. And he told his friend Richard Curl that he was conscious of his approaching death and was not very sorry to die. On July 3rd, 1924, he repeated an expression he had used in a desperate letter to H.G. Wells in October of 1905 and told Major Ernest Dawson, quote, I feel and probably look horribly limp and my spirits stand at about zero. Here you have the horrid truth, but I haven't been well for a long time and I have begun to feel like a cornered rat. Richard Curl, his friend, Boris, his son, and Boris's wife, Joan, and their 6-month-old son, so Conrad's grandson, arrived at Oswald's, that was their house, for the bank holiday on August 1st, 1924, and found Conrad apparently well. The next day, Conrad took Richard Curl out in his car to see the new house he was thinking of renting. Though he suffered a sudden pain in his chest, another slight heart attack, he insisted they continue the journey. But when they got within a mile and a half of the house, he felt worse and agreed to turn back. Dr. Fox diagnosed the heart attack as acute indigestion, and a second doctor, who ordered a cylinder of oxygen and said Conrad should have his teeth removed as soon as possible, agreed that there was no cause for alarm. That evening, sensing the worst, Conrad told Boris, quote, "You know, I am really ill this time." At 8:30 on the morning of Sunday, August the 3rd, Conrad and Jessie, who was immobile in her bed after yet another operation, were alone in their adjoining rooms. He gasped the command, "Here, you." And she heard a heavy, shuffling sound, a dull thump, and then silence. His heart had stopped beating. He had slipped from his chair to the floor, and at the age of 66 was suddenly dead. Though Conrad had no religious belief, he was given a Catholic funeral by Jessie, who could not walk and did not attend the ceremony. It incongruously took place on August 7th amidst the crowded and flag-festooned Canterbury Cricket Festival. Conrad's sons, his friends Edward Garnett, Cunningham Graham, Sir Hugh and Lady Clifford, Alice Rothenstein, and a list of other people, Count Edward Rosinski, who represented the Polish minister, all attended the Mass at St. Thomas's Catholic Church. At the graveside in Canterbury Cemetery, Father Shepherd read the Catholic burial service. Quote, "So we left him," Cunningham Graham wrote, "with his sails all duly furled, ropes flemished down, and with the anchor holding truly in the kind Kentish earth." The moving epigraph from Spenser's The Faerie Queen, which Conrad had used on the title page of the Rover, was cut into the gray granite. "Sleep after toil, port after stormy seas, ease after war, death after life, does greatly please." And that was it. That was Joseph Conrad, 1924, age 66, 20 novels, countless short stories. Huge influence on everybody who read him.
The horror. That's the movie.
That's
very well done, Brad.
Thanks, man.
Awesome.
Yeah. Went long, but had to do it.
I'm so glad you went long. I hope the listeners got a lot out of it. You know where to find Brad. He mans the Twitter account. He is the captain of at Art of Dark Pod on Twitter, bringing that steamship forward every creaking inch, every cruel mile. Right. You can find him there. And then, of course, we're on Telegram too, t.me/Art of Dark Pod. What are we going to talk about in the After Dark? Remind me.
Yeah, we're going to talk about when Conrad tried to kill himself as a young man. And we're going to talk a little bit about what Conrad thought of other great writers who he's been compared to, Herman Melville and Dostoevsky.
Last time I'll make the pitch on this episode, patreon.com/Art of Dark Pod. You get access to the book club, access to every single After Dark episode, which we do for every episode we record. The core of the show are these core episodes, which you've just finished listening to, or you're in the process of finishing. And we endeavor to do 2 of these a month. Brad puts one together. I put one together. And then beyond all of that, there are the Darkroom episodes. We get great guests. If you can find it in your heart to chuck $5 a month or more at this podcast, we would greatly appreciate it. So we can continue to do this, not for 1 more year, but for 5, 10 more years indefinitely. We'll keep going until one of us drops dead.
There's no shortage of subjects. That's for sure.
Yeah. Right. And so if you like the show, let us know. And if we got something wrong, let us know that too. We're always, we hear from people. Sometimes we get something wrong. We're very curious. We really love our listeners and just genuinely appreciate it. Brad, we got to close with a question. I'm going to ask you, actually.
Okay.
Even though you delivered it, I want to ask you, what the hell is Joseph Conrad doing if he's alive now?
Yeah, I mean, I think his depression, I think there was a darkness in him that he was always out running and sometimes was losing to. And I think it was always going to get him. And I don't necessarily mean physically. Yeah, I think at some point he was going to run out of steam. Like towards the end there where he's saying, I'm played out. I don't think that was just about his physical health. I think his sort of demons had finally taken their root in him. And I fear. I usually say, oh, he would have still been like when we ask this, it's like he'd still be writing, but they'd be doing something slightly different. I'm not sure Conrad would have. I think he might have. I think he might have. He would have come to the end where he couldn't go on anymore. But I don't know. What do
Well,
you think?
I think of Conrad. I'll flip the other side of the coin there and try to
Mhm.
imagine him as a young man setting out to write now. I think
Mhm.
he would have a lot to tell us now about our time now. I wonder
Mhm.
what he would be focused on. Um, if not colonialism, if not the sea. I think he probably would be writing about the internet and
Probably.
AI,
Mm.
uh, and culture around that. I think
Mhm.
possibly. Impossible to say though. We can only speculate.
It,
Brad, that was
yeah.
outstanding. I
Thank you.
that is probably I haven't done. I didn't do the research on Conrad, but is there a single source for a fairly comprehensive Joseph Conrad biography online profile?
I
No.
don't know. Not that I know of. Not
There
that it's, I think this
will
is
be
it.
after I post this bish. So here we go. Hey, great job,
Yeah.
Brad. I had a
Thanks,
really
man.
good time.
Appreciate it.
Please stick around for Patreon. Get on the After Dark. Whether you do or you don't, I'm coming in hot next week with kind of a bit of a curveball. I'm going to
Hmm.
cover the great Jewish Austrian architect Victor Grun,
Mm.
who invented the mall.
Yeah.
He's going to be our first architect,
This is going to
and
be cool because I've already learned more about him than I knew in just what you just said. So this is
there
this
you
is
go.
cool.
So you went for big air, and then I'm going to go on a little detour. But listen, as much as Joseph Conrad has influenced your life, Victor
Hmm.
Grun, in a way that you probably
Hmm.
don't realize, has also influenced your life.
Very cool.
And I'm excited. I got my book. It was a little delayed, my second book, but we're going to go. We're going to get it done. Any final words on Conrad before we take a quick break?
No, I don't think so. I mean, if people are looking for one thing to read, Heart of Darkness is obviously the one. If you've already read Heart of Darkness and you haven't read anything else, Secret Agent for psychopolitical espionage, conspiracy, paranoia. It's great. And then don't neglect the short stories. There's a bunch of really great short stories. The Secret Sharer is one that I really liked. So yeah, just do some of the reading and spend your time with it. This is not, you have to remember, this is a man out of the 19th century. He's not writing and I love Twitter. He's not writing Twitter posts. This is a man he's taking his time. If you're going to read it, get into that speed. Is one thing I would say.
Put the phone away, light a
Hmm.
candle, get a nice lamp, get
Hmm.
cozy, and
Hmm.
get ready to read paragraphs that go on for 3 pages. Hey, Brad, you know what I got here?
What you got?
You can see it on the YouTube. People can see it. I've got my perfect detonator.
Oh God. Terrified.